Tonight, we ask you to step out of the familiar light of the modern era and walk with us into a world defined by relentless sun, grinding exhaustion, and the unforgiving limits of human endurance. We are traveling back to the late 6th century, standing in the vast hyper-arid center of the Arabian Peninsula, looking outward at a global geopolitical landscape that is actively, systematically tearing itself to pieces. To truly comprehend the sheer, almost mathematically impossible magnitude of the empire that is about to rise from these sands, you must first understand the terrifying, bleeding vacuum of power from which it emerged. To the distant northwest, the massive bureaucratic, exhausted machinery of the Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of Rome, is desperately trying to project its military authority from the heavily fortified walls of Constantinople. To the northeast, across the jagged mountains and deep river valleys, the ancient, fiercely aristocratic Sassanid Persian Empire sits behind its own heavy fortifications, commanding the vast, unimaginably wealthy trade routes of the Silk Road. These two colossal superpowers are not simply rivals. They have spent the better part of a century locked in a devastating, exhaustive, unwinnable cycle of total apocalyptic war. They have burned each other's ancient border cities to the ground, drained their massive imperial treasuries, and bled an entire generation of young men into the dry, disputed earth of Syria and Mesopotamia. And sandwiched directly between these exhausted, paranoid global titans is the massive, seemingly empty, imposing expanse of the deep Arabian desert. The emperors in Constantinople and the kings in Ctesiphon look at this sprawling, stateless void of scorching red sand and jagged black basalt mountains, and they see nothing of strategic or economic value. It is a landscape so fundamentally brutal, so devoid of massive agricultural centers, navigable rivers, or permanent infrastructure, that a traditional military occupation is not just difficult, it is a logistical impossibility. The Romans and the Persians simply choose to ignore the deep interior, preferring to hire the fierce, mobile Bedouin tribes sitting on the desert fringes to act as heavily armed mercenaries, border guards, and political buffer states. They leave the deep heart of Arabia to its own devices, abandoning it to a harsh, ancient system of human survival where the only recognizable law is the unyielding law of the tribe. In this terrifying, stateless void, there are no standing police forces, there are no central courts of justice, and there is no overarching imperial authority to protect the weak, the poor, or the vulnerable from the heavily armed strong. Your physical survival, your access to water, and your basic human dignity depend entirely upon your bloodline, your family name, and the collective, organized protection of your specific tribe. If you belong to a massive, wealthy, powerful tribe, you walk the desert untouchable because any attack on your person will instantly trigger a massive, multi-generational blood feud that could annihilate the offending clan. But if you are an outcast, a debtor, an orphan, or stateless, you are invisible, essentially operating as vulnerable prey in a society that respects only wealth and the capacity for extreme violence. And yet, within this chaotic, fractured, dangerous landscape, hidden in a barren, rocky valley that cannot even sustain basic subsistence agriculture, sits the most important anomaly of the ancient world. It is a thriving, populated city called Mecca, a strategic, organized settlement that has managed to transform its inhospitable geography into unassailable geopolitical leverage. The city is controlled entirely by the Quraysh, a brilliant, cynical, wealthy tribe of merchants who have engineered what is arguably the greatest masterpiece of economic statecraft in the region's history. The leaders of the Quraysh understood that in a sprawling desert defined by endless chaotic tribal warfare, the single most valuable, coveted commodity a city could possibly offer was guaranteed safety. They built their sprawling economic empire around a small, ancient, unassuming cubic stone structure located in the geographic center of the valley, known to the tribes as the Kaaba. Long before the rise of the monotheistic empire that would eventually claim it, the Kaaba was already a sacred, revered destination for the fragmented, polytheistic tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. The structure housed roughly 360 different idols, a diverse, carefully curated collection representing the fractured spiritual beliefs of virtually every single Bedouin tribe that wandered the desert sands. The true genius of the Quraysh leadership was not fundamentally religious. It was profound, ruthless, and brilliant economic statecraft. They declared the entire geographic area immediately surrounding the Kaaba to be a haram, a sacred, inviolable sanctuary where the drawing of weapons, the settling of vendettas, and the spilling of human blood was strictly forbidden under penalty of absolute exile. This religious rule was enforced with rigidity by the merchant lords, guaranteeing that even the most bitter, violent tribal enemies could walk the dusty streets of Mecca with physical security. By neutralizing the constant, exhausting threat of violence, the Quraysh transformed a barren, scorching valley into the ultimate neutral zone, a protected safe harbor where large volumes of wealth could be exchanged without the constant fear of armed raiding. Mecca essentially became the Geneva and the Wall Street of the ancient Middle East, the single, indispensable logistical hub connecting the heavy lucrative trade routes of Yemen in the south to the wealthy, insatiable markets of the Byzantine and Persian empires in the north. Thousands of heavily laden, organized camel caravans passed through the narrow mountain corridors of the city every single season, carrying fragrant frankincense, rare Indian spices, heavy Yemeni silk, and beautifully crafted Damascus steel. The Quraysh sat comfortably at the exact center of this massive, complex global supply chain, extracting heavy transit taxes, managing lucrative logistics, and accumulating liquid wealth on a scale that defied the harshness of their barren environment. They were no longer simply desert survivalists living hand to mouth. They were sophisticated international brokers, integrated into the global economy, and proudly arrogant in their undisputed regional supremacy. But this sudden, massive influx of global, unchecked wealth began to quietly rot the traditional social fabric of the merchant city from the inside out. The ancient communal values of the deep desert, which historically demanded that the wealthy members of a tribe must fiercely protect and financially provide for the weak, the widows, and the orphans, were rapidly dissolving. They were being replaced by a cold, aggressive, unsentimental form of hyper-capitalism, where the elite merchant lords hoarded their massive fortunes behind heavy wooden doors, viewing poverty not as a communal failure, but as personal weakness. Meccan society stratified with brutal, terrifying speed, creating an untouchable, wealthy upper class that dominated the political and economic life of the city, while an invisible, vulnerable underclass of slaves, debtors, and orphans struggled simply to survive the searing heat. The leaders of the Quraysh, sitting in their shaded courtyards and counting their silver, genuinely believed that their unequal system was flawless, permanently secure, and immune to the chaotic political fluctuations of the outside world. They worshipped the heavy stone idols in the Kaaba not just as spiritual deities, but as the fundamental, non-negotiable guarantors of their economic monopoly, their tourism revenue, and their political dominance. They looked out at the massive, exhausted Roman and Persian empires bleeding to the north, and they looked down at the fractured, constantly warring Bedouin tribes of the desert, and they felt nothing but supreme, untouchable confidence. They could not possibly imagine that the greatest, most devastating threat to their profitable merchant republic would not come from a massive, heavily armored Byzantine legion marching slowly across the sand. They could not fathom that the fatal blow would come from within their fortified, arrogant city, arising directly from the social underclass they had systematically chosen to exploit and ignore. The ultimate disruption of the Arabian order, the spark that would incinerate the ancient world, was already quietly walking through the bustling, spice-scented markets of Mecca, silently observing the extreme wealth and the profound moral decay of his own people. He possessed no standing army, he commanded no massive trade caravans, and his bloodline, while undeniably noble, had been sidelined by the ruthless, aggressive reality of aristocratic tribal politics. The foundation of the modern geopolitical world was about to violently shift, not through the swinging of an imperial sword, but through the observant, vulnerable eyes of an orphaned child entirely devoid of political leverage. To fully grasp the immense, precarious nature of Muhammad's early life, you must discard the modern, romanticized concept of childhood. In the brutal, fiercely pragmatic reality of 6th century Mecca, a child was not viewed as a fragile dependent deserving of unconditional societal protection. A child was an economic asset, a future warrior, and a strict legal extension of their father's political power within the tribal hierarchy. And if you did not have a father, the heavy, unforgiving machinery of Bedouin law essentially rendered you invisible. Muhammad was born in the year 570, entering the world already burdened by the most dangerous social status a Meccan could possess. His father, Abdullah, a young merchant of the Banu Hashim clan, had died on a trade journey to Yathrib months before his son drew his first breath. Abdullah left behind a meager inheritance consisting of exactly 5 camels, a small flock of sheep, and a single Abyssinian slave girl named Barakah. Under the rigid, non-negotiable inheritance laws of the Quraysh, an infant could not inherit the wealth or the political standing of the father. Tribal law explicitly dictated that property and power could only be passed to male relatives who were old enough to mount a horse, wield a sword, and physically defend the clan's assets in battle. The infant was disinherited, leaving him reliant on the charitable protection of his extended family in a society that increasingly viewed charity as a weakness. To ensure his physical survival, his family adhered to an ancient, calculated aristocratic tradition practiced by the urban elites of the Quraysh. Almost immediately after his birth, he was sent away from the crowded, disease-prone, and suffocatingly hot urban center of Mecca to live with a nomadic Bedouin tribe in the deep interior of the desert. The Meccans did not do this out of cruelty. They did it because the harsh environment of the open desert was essentially a massive, effective evolutionary forge. A child raised in the deep sands developed a robust physical immunity, a profound physiological endurance, and most importantly, a flawless mastery of the pure, uncorrupted Arabic language spoken by the nomads. But the transaction of fosterage was fundamentally economic. Wet nurses from the desert traveled to the city specifically to find the infants of wealthy merchants, expecting handsome payments and lucrative patronage in return. When the women of the Banu Sa'd tribe arrived in Mecca that year, every single one of them systematically bypassed the orphaned infant. They knew that without a living father to guarantee a substantial financial reward, nursing the child was a massive economic liability. A poor Bedouin woman named Halima, who had arrived late to the city on an exhausted, starving donkey, only accepted the orphan because every other wealthy child had already been taken, and returning to the desert empty-handed was a matter of profound shame. For the first few years of his life, Muhammad did not learn the intricate, cynical mercantile negotiations of the city. He learned the terrifying vulnerability of nomadic survival. He lived in goat-hair tents, tracking the unpredictable, sparse rainfall and managing the grazing patterns of sheep across jagged, sun-blasted basalt fields. He learned early that survival in a resource-starved environment requires communal discipline, where the failure of a single individual to perfectly execute their duty could result in the death of the entire camp. This visceral immersion into the vast, silent void of the desert fundamentally shaped his psychological baseline, instilling a macro perspective that the wealthy merchants locked inside the narrow valley of Mecca lacked. When he was finally returned to the city at the age of 5, the temporary, fragile illusion of stability was rapidly, methodically shattered by a cascade of personal devastation. At the age of 6, his mother Amina took him on a sprawling, multi-week caravan journey north to the oasis of Yathrib, intending to visit her relatives and show the boy the unmarked grave of the father he had never met. The journey itself was a massive logistical undertaking, traversing nearly 300 miles of hostile, scorching terrain across the ancient coastal trade route known as the Hijaz. But on the agonizing, exposed return journey back to Mecca, Amina suddenly fell violently ill, struck down by a fast-acting desert fever at a desolate, isolated way station called Abwa. The 6-year-old boy stood in the blowing sand and watched his mother die, powerless as she was lowered into a shallow, unmarked grave on the side of a barren trade route. He returned to Mecca not just fatherless, but severed from his immediate biological anchor, a profound trauma that instantly cemented his position as the ultimate, vulnerable outsider. The guardianship of the boy legally fell to his paternal grandfather, Abi Talib, the aging, respected patriarch of the Banu Hashim clan, who held the prestigious political duty of providing water to the pilgrims visiting the Kaaba. Abi Talib loved the boy fiercely, openly defying the rigid social norms of the city by allowing the orphan to sit on his personal carpet in the shadow of the Kaaba, a space strictly reserved for the senior merchant lords. But the political reality of the Banu Hashim was rapidly deteriorating, their massive historical prestige slowly being eclipsed by wealthier, aggressive rival clans like the Banu Umayyah, who were dominating the northern trade routes. And the grandfather's protection, while weighty in legal standing, was dictated by the fragile, rapidly expiring clock of his own advanced age. When Muhammad was just 8 years old, Abi Talib died, plunging the Banu Hashim into a severe leadership crisis and severing the boy's final, direct link to high-level aristocratic protection. The boy was passed down the tribal hierarchy once again, landing in the household of his uncle, Abi Talib, the newly elected chief of the Banu Hashim. Abi Talib was a man of immense personal honor, respected throughout the city for his fairness and diplomatic skill, but he was also a man managing a bankrupt clan, struggling with severe debt and a massive extended family he could barely afford to feed. Under the roof of Abi Talib, Muhammad realized that he could no longer simply exist as a passive dependent. His physical survival now required active, grueling economic contribution. He spent his early adolescence performing the lowest, least respected labor available in the rigid hierarchy of Mecca, working as a hired shepherd, tending the flocks of wealthier merchants on the barren, rocky hills overlooking the city. Shepherding was a solitary, quiet occupation that removed him from the loud, aggressive, corrupt political maneuvering of the central markets. It taught him the mechanics of vigilance, the management of vulnerable assets, and the necessity of patience, traits that were despised by the fast-moving, risk-taking speculators of the Quraysh. But his uncle, acting as the leader of an indebted clan, could not afford to let the boy remain isolated in the hills. When Muhammad was 12 years old, Abi Talib organized a massive, complex trade expedition, preparing to lead a heavy caravan north into the wealthy, taxed frontier of Roman Syria. The boy begged his uncle to take him along, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of Mecca, and finally witness the massive, lucrative global supply chains that actually generated the city's wealth. Abi Talib agreed, bringing the 12-year-old boy into the militarized, unforgiving logistical reality of an international trade caravan. A Meccan caravan was not a casual group of travelers. It was a massive, disciplined paramilitary operation, often consisting of thousands of camels, dozens of armed mercenaries, and complex administrative logistics. Managing the caravan required securing fragile, constantly shifting non-aggression pacts with the hostile Bedouin tribes whose territories they had to cross, paying heavy extortion fees simply to access the crucial water wells. They had to carefully balance the massive weight of their cargo, manage the strict, unforgiving rationing of water bladders, and navigate purely by the position of the stars to avoid the deadly heat of the midday sun. The young Muhammad watched his uncle negotiate these tense, high-stakes diplomatic encounters, learning precisely how to leverage tribal honor, exploit rivalries, and secure safe passage through diplomacy rather than bloodshed. The journey took them out of the stateless void of the Arabian desert and directly into the fortified, administered southern frontier of the Byzantine Empire, arriving at the massive trading hub of Bosra. For a boy who had spent his entire life in a small dusty valley filled with crude stone idols and localized blood feuds, arriving in Byzantine Syria was a profound, paradigm-shifting geopolitical shock. Bosra was a massive city built of heavy black basalt, featuring towering Roman architecture, sweeping colonnaded streets, massive aqueducts, and the undeniable presence of an organized, centralized imperial administration. Here, he saw the reality of a true state, a society governed by written laws, complex taxation systems, and the overwhelming visible power of the Roman military machine. He observed the bustling, diverse markets where Greek merchants, Persian defectors, Syrian farmers, and Arab traders exchanged massive quantities of goods using minted gold coins instead of basic barter. And perhaps most importantly, he was suddenly exposed to the complex, institutionalized monotheistic religions of the wider world. The Roman Empire was officially, aggressively Christian, and the landscape was dotted with massive stone monasteries, hermitage caves, and structured theological communities that baffled the polytheistic Meccans. During one of the caravan's halts, local historical records note an encounter with a Christian monk named Bahira, a solitary ascetic who lived in a small cell observing the lucrative transit of the Arab merchants. Bahira invited the mechanics of the caravan to a meal, an unusually hospitable gesture from an isolated monk, and closely observed the young Muhammad, supposedly recognizing physical and behavioral markers that aligned with ancient prophecies of a coming leader. Whether you view this encounter through the lens of theology or pure historical diplomacy, the reality is that Muhammad was actively engaging in high-level theological conversations with representatives of the dominant global faiths. He listened to the complex, intellectual debates about the nature of God, the concept of a written divine law, and the stark, terrifying ideas of a final judgment and an afterlife. He compared these massive universal structured philosophical concepts with the localized transactional corrupt polytheism of his own people back in Mecca. The Quraysh worshipped their stone idols not out of spiritual devotion, but purely as a mechanism to guarantee their trade monopolies. Lacking the moral framework to address the extreme poverty and social decay rotting their city, the caravan journey to Syria cracked the walls of Muhammad's worldview, stripping away the arrogant Meccan illusion that their tiny valley was the center of the universe. He returned from Bosra with a sophisticated, macroscopic understanding of global trade networks, imperial politics, and the overarching power of monotheistic statecraft. He spent the remainder of his adolescence actively working within this dangerous, lucrative trade network, slowly ascending from a mere camel driver to an independent commercial agent. He did not inherit a massive fleet of caravans or a hidden vault of silver. He had to meticulously, carefully build his position upon the only untaxable asset available to an orphan, his own reputation. In a market dominated by ruthless price gouging, heavy usury, and the frequent defrauding of foreign merchants who had no tribal protection, Muhammad chose a radical, calculated economic strategy. He executed his contracts with rigid transparency, strictly refusing to exploit the vulnerable, delivering exact weights, and honoring his financial obligations even when it temporarily cost him his own profit margin. This was not merely an act of personal piety. It was a brilliant, effective long-term business strategy in an unregulated market where trust was the rarest, most valued commodity. Foreign investors and wealthy Meccan brokers quickly realized that handing their capital to the young orphan guaranteed a safe, honest return on their risky investments. His reputation slowly began to eclipse his vulnerable social status, proving that a man devoid of aristocratic leverage could actively command the respect of the market through sheer, uncompromising integrity. By the time he reached his mid-20s, the disinherited orphan who had watched his mother die in the desert had transformed himself into a capable, respected logistical expert. He understood the brutal mechanics of tribal negotiation. He knew exactly how to navigate the hostile, taxed frontiers of the dying global empires, and he intimately understood the terrifying vulnerability of the poor. Before he could fully step into the highest echelons of the Meccan elite, Muhammad participated in a specific, historical event that permanently cemented his political philosophy regarding the necessity of justice. The rapid, aggressive expansion of the Meccan economy had created a terrifying loophole in tribal law, where foreign merchants visiting the city to trade their goods were frequently scammed by arrogant, powerful aristocrats who simply refused to pay them. Because the foreign merchants did not belong to a recognized Meccan tribe, they had no legal recourse, no police force to appeal to, and no clan to physically enforce the execution of the contract. A particularly egregious incident occurred when a trader from the distant region of Zabid arrived in the city, sold a massive shipment of valuable goods to a powerful leader of the Quraysh, and was aggressively denied his payment. The defrauded merchant stood on the high rocky slopes of Mount Abu Qubays overlooking the Kaaba, loudly, desperately shouting a poem that shamed the entire population of Mecca for abandoning the ancient Arabian codes of hospitality. The shame was so profound, so damaging to the city's delicate, vital reputation as a safe harbor for international trade, that a small, progressive faction of the Quraysh decided to immediately intervene. Abu Talib and several other clan leaders convened a massive, secretive political summit inside the house of a wealthy merchant, bypassing the traditional, corrupt city council known as the Dar al-Nadwa. They drafted a revolutionary, unprecedented political alliance known as the Hilf al Fudul, or the League of the Virtuous, a legal pact that altered the mechanics of justice within the city. The members of this league explicitly, legally bound themselves to physically protect any individual, whether they were a native Meccan, a foreigner, a free man, or a slave, who suffered injustice or financial fraud within the borders of the city. They swore to collectively pool their wealth and their martial strength to forcefully extract stolen property from the oppressors and return it to the victims, regardless of the oppressor's aristocratic status. Muhammad, still a young man, was present in that room, standing alongside the elder statesman, and he witnessed the birth of a profound paradigm-shifting political concept. He saw that a coalition of determined, disciplined individuals could actively rewrite the laws of society to protect the vulnerable, bypassing the rigid, unfair constraints of traditional blood loyalty. Years later, as the supreme leader of a massive empire, he would explicitly reference this exact treaty, stating that the principles of justice established in the house of that merchant were vastly more valuable to him than a herd of red camels. The pact provided a temporary, localized bandage over the gaping wounds of Meccan inequality, but it also clearly highlighted the fragility of a system that relied on the voluntary charity of a few good men. The city was a powder keg of unresolved social tension, filled with massive guarded warehouses, overflowing with Roman gold and Persian silver, surrounded by a desperate, leveraged underclass drowning in aggressive, high-interest debt. The merchant lords controlled the flow of water. They controlled the pricing of grain, and they controlled the lucrative religious tourism generated by the pagan idols surrounding the Kaaba. They essentially ran a massive, cynical extortion racket, leveraging the desperate spiritual beliefs of the desert tribes to maximize the foot traffic through their profitable commercial markets. Muhammad understood exactly how this corrupt machine operated, because he had spent his entire life working inside its gears, observing the brutal, efficient extraction of wealth from the lowest rungs of the social ladder. He knew that the system could not be reformed by simply asking the wealthy to be slightly more charitable, because the entire architecture of the Quraysh's power was built upon the aggressive exploitation of the weak. He was a man suspended between two different incompatible realities, possessing the educated macroeconomic awareness of the elite, while still carrying the permanent, painful psychological scars of the disinherited orphan. He walked the crowded, spice-scented streets of the market, a quiet, observant logistical operator, fully armed with the diplomatic skills of his uncle and the unyielding integrity forged in the deep desert. He was perfectly positioned, trained, and frustrated, standing quietly on the edge of the chessboard, watching the merchant lords confidently play a game that he was about to violently overturn. He was standing on the threshold of adulthood, quietly accumulating the economic leverage and the geopolitical awareness necessary to challenge the entrenched, corrupt merchant lords of his own city, but to transition from a respected working-class commercial agent to a man possessing the ultimate power to disrupt the mechanisms of the Quraysh. He required access to unassailable capital, and that capital was currently locked securely behind the heavy wooden doors of the single most powerful, independent female merchant in the entire city of Mecca, an aristocrat who was quietly searching for a man she could actually trust. To understand the delicate, strategic rise of Muhammad within the treacherous social hierarchy of Mecca, you must first examine the lethal mechanics of the ancient Arabian trade economy. In a city that produced no agricultural goods, no textiles, and no raw materials, the entire survival of the population depended exclusively on the continuous, unbroken movement of commercial capital. The merchant lords of the Quraysh operated a sophisticated, ruthless system of venture capitalism known as mudarabah, a profit-sharing partnership designed to distribute the massive risks of desert transit. Wealthy investors would pool their silver, purchase massive quantities of Yemeni leather, frankincense, and Eastern spices, and entrust the cargo to a hired commercial agent who would lead the caravan across the hostile desert to the lucrative markets of Roman Syria. If the caravan succeeded, the agent took a predetermined percentage of the profits. But if the caravan was raided by bandits, destroyed by a sandstorm, or simply mismanaged by an incompetent agent, the investors lost everything. This system created a terrifying vulnerability for the wealthiest residents of Mecca, because finding an agent who possessed both the logistical brilliance to navigate the desert and the fundamental honesty to not embezzle the profits was rare. It was common practice for hired agents to secretly sell off portions of the cargo during the journey, blame the loss on fictitious Bedouin raids, and quietly pocket the difference while presenting the investors with a heavily doctored ledger. In this environment of pervasive, normalized corporate fraud, a wealthy investor without a loyal, armed male relative to oversee their assets was essentially a prime target for financial predation. And the single wealthiest, most exposed investor in the entire city of Mecca was a woman named Khadija bint Khuwaylid. Khadija was a formidable, intelligent, aristocratic widow who had inherited a massive commercial empire. commanding trade caravans that were historically reported to be larger than the combined caravans of the entire Quraysh tribe. In a patriarchal, aggressive Bedouin society that legally viewed women as property to be inherited, rather than independent political actors, Khadijah had managed to maintain control over her vast fortune through sheer, uncompromising commercial brilliance. She had repeatedly firmly rejected marriage proposals from the most powerful, arrogant merchant lords of the city, perfectly aware that under tribal law, a new husband would instantly gain legal authority to dismantle and absorb her corporate assets. But to maintain her empire, she required capable male agents to physically lead her caravans out of the city and into the dangerous taxed frontiers of the Byzantine Empire. After suffering severe financial losses at the hands of corrupt managers who had quietly skimmed her profits, Khadijah began actively searching for an agent whose reputation for honesty defied the corrupt norms of the market. Her extensive network of informants and market brokers repeatedly returned with a single respected name: a young orphaned man from the Banu Hashim clan who had earned the rare, coveted title of Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Muhammad was 25 years old, possessing no capital of his own, but carrying a flawless, scrutinized public record of transparency in his handling of weights, measures, and foreign contracts. Khadijah approached him with a lucrative, unprecedented offer, promising to pay him double the standard commission if he would personally manage her next massive, critical trade expedition to the Roman trading hub of Bosra. To ensure the security of her investment, she sent her most trusted personal servant, an observant man named Maysara, to physically accompany Muhammad on the journey and secretly report back on his management tactics. The journey to Syria was not a simple transit. It was a complex, contested military and economic maneuver through hostile territory. When the massive caravan finally arrived in the bustling, competitive markets of Bosra, Muhammad did not engage in the traditional, aggressive price gouging tactics favored by the older Meccan merchants. He understood that the local Byzantine merchants despised the arrogant, transactional nature of the Arab traders, and he actively leveraged this tension to secure exclusive, favorable wholesale contracts. Maysara quietly watched as Muhammad meticulously negotiated complex barter agreements, trading the raw frankincense and leather for valuable Roman-manufactured goods, Damascus steel, and fine silk, without ever resorting to the customary fraud or deception. Historical records note a specific incident during the market trades where an arrogant Byzantine merchant demanded that Muhammad swear an oath by the Meccan idols to guarantee a contract. Muhammad politely refused to invoke the pagan deities, securing the transaction upon the weight of his own personal reputation and the exact, mathematically flawless delivery of the goods. He undercut the corrupt middlemen who usually preyed upon the Meccan caravans, maximizing the profit margins by executing tight, disciplined logistical trades before the market prices could artificially inflate. When the caravan finally returned to the scorching valley of Mecca weeks later, the financial return was staggering, yielding a profit that historically doubled what Khadijah had initially projected. Maysara delivered a detailed, glowing intelligence report to his employer, outlining not just the massive financial success of the expedition, but the profound, unusual moral character of the young agent who had led it. Khadijah, analyzing the rare combination of financial integrity and logistical brilliance, realized that she had found something vastly more valuable than a mere commercial agent. She saw a man devoid of the toxic, arrogant ambition that poisoned the other merchant lords. A man who possessed the tactical capacity to defend her empire without the aggressive desire to dominate her. Breaking virtually every single aristocratic social convention in the city, Khadijah did not wait for a male guardian to arrange a political alliance. She quietly dispatched a close friend named Nafisa to secretly delicately propose marriage to Muhammad on her behalf. The proposal was a massive geopolitical shock to the rigid social hierarchy of the Quraysh. Khadija was 40 years old, independently wealthy, and belonged to the powerful Banu Asad clan, while Muhammad was a 25-year-old orphan from the politically declining, indebted Banu Hashim. But Muhammad, recognizing the profound stabilizing power of her intellect and the rarity of a true equal partnership in a society built on domination, gratefully accepted the proposal. The marriage ceremony was a political, visible event, formally negotiated by his uncle Abi Talib, who stood before the elite families of Mecca and proudly recited the lineage and the unmatched personal honor of his nephew to compensate for the glaring lack of a dowry. This marriage fundamentally transformed the entire geopolitical trajectory of Muhammad's life, pulling him directly out of the vulnerable, exposed working class and placing him firmly within the highest echelons of the Meccan elite. He suddenly possessed massive, unassailable financial stability, residing in a large protected courtyard home shielded from the crushing, aggressive debt cycles that ruined so many families in the lower valley. The union provided him with the ultimate social armor, allowing him to walk into the central council meetings near the Kaaba, not as a hired shepherd or a lowly agent, but as the recognized legal partner of the wealthiest woman in the city. But rather than using this massive influx of capital and status to simply integrate into the corrupt, decadent lifestyle of the merchant lords, Muhammad quietly, methodically began to isolate himself from their toxic political culture. He used his new financial freedom to actively settle the crippling debts of the poor, quietly purchase the freedom of abused slaves, and support the widows and orphans that the rest of the city had systematically abandoned. He was living within the belly of the beast, intimately observing the cynical, organized extortion mechanisms of the elite, while fundamentally rejecting every single moral compromise required to maintain their power. The terrifying fragility of the Meccan political system and Muhammad's supreme, unrecognized talent for high-stakes diplomacy was spectacularly demonstrated several years later during a major architectural crisis that nearly plunged the city into a massive civil war. The Kaaba, the sacred cubic structure that served as the economic and spiritual center of the Arabian Peninsula, was structurally compromised. It was originally built as a simple, roofless enclosure made of dry stacked stones without mortar, and a massive, unexpected flash flood tearing through the narrow valley had undermined its ancient foundations. To compound the disaster, a woman burning incense near the structure had accidentally set fire to the heavy wooden coverings, leaving the sacred building in a state of dangerous, humiliating ruin. The leaders of the Quraysh realized that if they did not immediately rebuild the sanctuary, they would lose their religious authority over the superstitious desert tribes, instantly destroying the lucrative tourism economy. In a rare moment of geopolitical luck, a massive Byzantine merchant ship was caught in a severe storm and violently shipwrecked on the coral reefs near the coastal port of Jeddah, just a few days' ride from Mecca. The Quraysh quickly dispatched armed riders to the coast, purchased the salvaged valuable timber from the wrecked ship, and hired a skilled Coptic Christian carpenter named Bakum, who had survived the crash. The tribes of Mecca collectively pooled their resources, strictly agreeing to only use pure, uncorrupted funds to rebuild the sanctuary, explicitly forbidding money earned from prostitution, usury, or the violent raiding of innocent caravans. The reconstruction proceeded smoothly, with the various rival clans working together to raise the heavy stone walls layer by layer until they reached the specific height required to place the most sacred artifact in the city. The Black Stone, or the Hajar al-Aswad, was an ancient venerated meteorite that predated the tribal settlement of Mecca, an artifact that conveyed supreme, unquestionable political legitimacy to whoever possessed the right to physically handle it. When the time came to lift the heavy stone and permanently place it into the eastern corner of the new wall, the temporary, fragile alliance between the clans violently disintegrated. Every single major clan leader instantly recognized that the man who physically placed the stone would essentially be universally acknowledged as the supreme, undisputed political sovereign of Mecca, a title that no single tribe was willing to concede to another. The argument escalated from a polite diplomatic dispute in the courtyard to an aggressive military standoff, paralyzing the reconstruction effort and threatening to instantly break the sacred truce of the city. The tension reached a horrifying, critical breaking point when the leaders of the Banu Abdi el-Dar and the Banu Adi clans brought a heavy bowl filled with fresh animal blood into the shadow of the Kaaba. In an ancient, terrifying Bedouin ritual known as the Pact of Blood, the leaders plunged their bare hands directly into the bowl, swearing a sacred, non-negotiable oath to fight to the death before allowing a rival clan to lift the stone. The Merchant Republic was literally hours away from a massive, devastating civil war that would have permanently destroyed the neutral sanctuary and vaporized their international trade monopoly. For 4 agonizing, armed days, the work on the Kaaba remained halted, with the rival militias staring each other down across the dusty courtyard, hands resting firmly on the hilts of their Damascus swords. Finally, Abu Umayyah, the single oldest, most respected elder in the entire city, stepped between the warring factions and proposed a desperate, randomized diplomatic compromise to save the city from total annihilation. He declared that the decision of who would lift the stone would be surrendered to fate, dictating that the very next man to walk through the gate of Az-Safa into the sacred courtyard would be granted authority to arbitrate the dispute. The armed warlords of the Quraysh agreed to the compromise, stepping back and watching the massive wooden gate with deep, suffocating tension. The man who quietly, accidentally walked through the gate at that exact historical moment was Muhammad. When the furious, armed clan leaders saw him approach, a profound, collective sigh of relief swept through the tense courtyard, because despite his political marginalization, his personal reputation was unassailable. They loudly declared, "This is Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. We are fully satisfied with his judgment." The warlords quickly explained the explosive political crisis to him, expecting the young man to be paralyzed by the massive life or death responsibility suddenly dropped onto his shoulders. Muhammad did not hesitate. He did not convene a long, drawn-out committee, and he did not attempt to elevate his own clan by claiming the honor for himself, which would have instantly triggered the bloodshed he was trying to prevent. He quietly removed his heavy, wide-woven cloak from his shoulders, spread it flat on the dusty ground, and used his own hands to physically lift the heavy black stone, placing it exactly in the dead center of the fabric. He then looked up at the armed, hostile leaders of the 4 primary warring factions, and calmly ordered each of them to take firm hold of one corner of the cloak. The warlords, stunned by the sheer, elegant brilliance of the solution, stepped forward together, each man pulling the heavy fabric taut, physically sharing the exact, equal weight of the sacred artifact. They lifted the stone together in perfect choreographed political harmony, neutralizing the crisis by distributing the immense prestige equally among the highest echelons of the Meccan elite. When they raised the cloak to the exact height of the empty corner, Muhammad reached in with his own hands, physically guided the heavy stone into its permanent resting place, and sealed the masonry. This specific, historical minor plot was not merely a clever architectural compromise. It was a masterful, profound display of high-level geopolitical de-escalation. Muhammad had walked into an armed, deadlocked military crisis, intuitively analyzed the fragile egos and the complex tribal dynamics of the warring factions, and instantly engineered a solution that saved the entire city from burning to the ground. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he possessed a rare, sophisticated capacity for statecraft. an ability to unify divided, aggressive human beings toward a singular, constructive purpose. But the resolution of the Black Stone crisis, while preventing a civil war, did not resolve the painful psychological isolation that Muhammad was experiencing within his own society. As he walked away from the newly rebuilt Kaaba, leaving the wealthy merchant lords to celebrate their own survival, the stark, brutal reality of the city's fundamental injustice weighed upon him with an increasingly intolerable heaviness. He returned to his quiet, protected home, greeted by the unwavering support of Khadija, but the horrifying disparity between his own comfortable existence and the starving, exploited underclass outside his walls tormented his conscience. The elites of the Quraysh had successfully rebuilt their heavy stone monument, securing their lucrative monopoly, but the moral decay of their society was hollowing out the soul of the city. Infanticide was still quietly practiced by the poorest tribes to control population. Widows were still violently cast into the streets when their husbands died. And the unforgiving weight of high-interest loans continued to crush the working class into slavery. Muhammad realized that the cynical transactional polytheism of the Kaaba was not merely a spiritual error. It was the engineered ideological mechanism that legally justified the exploitation of the poor. The merchant lords used the idols to demand heavy sacrifices from the desperate, monopolizing the spiritual narrative to keep the population subservient to the economic demands of the elite. He found himself unable to participate in the loud, arrogant social gatherings of his peers, increasingly repulsed by the endless boasting, the heavy drinking, and the casual, systemic cruelty that defined aristocratic Meccan life. The suffocating noise of the bustling markets, the endless haggling over Byzantine silver, and the toxic, aggressive posturing of the tribal leaders began to feel like an unbearable physical weight. He needed total silence to process the complex existential crisis that was slowly, methodically tearing his worldview apart. He began leaving the city for days at a time, packing small, meager provisions of dry bread and dates, and walking away from the populated valley into the stark, barren, intimidating mountain ranges that surrounded Mecca. He was actively searching for a truth that the wealthy merchants could not buy, a form of justice that the tribal warlords could not violently intimidate, and a macro perspective that transcended the narrow, greedy confines of the Arabian trade routes. The trustworthy merchant had mastered the rules of the earthly game. He had secured the capital, he had achieved the status, and he had proven his diplomatic genius. But as he began the slow, exhausting climb up the jagged, sun-blasted rocks of Mount Jabal al-Nur, moving steadily toward a small, isolated cave near the summit, the rules of the earthly game were about to be permanently rewritten. The physical act of climbing Mount Jabal al-Nur is not a gentle meditative stroll. It is a brutal, exhausting vertical ascent across sharp, unforgiving volcanic rock. To leave the crowded, suffocatingly hot valley of Mecca and reach the small, jagged fissure near the summit known as the Cave of Hira, a man has to deliberately, physically separate himself from the entire infrastructure of human society. In the year 610, as Muhammad approached his 40th year, this grueling, isolating climb had become his non-negotiable psychological refuge. He engaged in an ancient solitary Arabian practice known as tahanath, leaving behind his massive commercial success, his comfortable courtyard home, and the relentless, toxic noise of the merchant markets for weeks at a time. From the narrow, elevated vantage point of the cave, he could sit in total heavy silence and look directly down upon the Kaaba, observing the tiny, distant movements of the caravans and the pilgrims circling the shrine below. From that macroscopic altitude, the massive, arrogant fortunes of the Quraysh, the guarded storehouses of silver, and the complex, corrupt tribal politics of the city looked small, fragile, and meaningless. He was actively searching for a unifying logic to the universe, a structural truth that could bypass the cynical, fragmented polytheism that the merchant lords used to legally justify their exploitation of the poor. And in the silent month of Ramadan, that unifying truth finally arrived, not as a gentle, euphoric spiritual awakening, but as a sudden, physically devastating, terrifying collision with the fabric of reality. The historical records strip away any romantic, airy mysticism from this moment, describing an encounter so overwhelming, so intensely physical, that it pushed Muhammad to the terrifying edge of his own biological limits. Alone in the dark, suffocating confines of the narrow cave, he was suddenly confronted by an immense, overwhelming presence that Islamic history identifies as the Archangel Jibril. This presence did not offer polite greetings or gentle philosophical guidance. It abruptly, violently seized him, engulfing his physical form and squeezing him with crushing pressure until he genuinely believed all the air had been permanently forced from his lungs. In the midst of this terrifying, breathless compression, a single command was delivered, instructing him simply to read or recite. Muhammad, a man who had spent his entire life mastering the complex logistics of global trade routes, but who was unlettered, desperately responded that he did not know how to read. The crushing, heavy pressure was instantly reapplied, vastly more intense than before, bringing him to the terrifying threshold of suffocation, before releasing him a second time with the exact same unyielding command to recite. When he answered again that he could not, the presence seized him a third time, applying an ultimate physical weight that shattered his mortal resistance, finally forcing the heavy, profound words of the first revelation to flow through his trembling lips. Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance, recite. And your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. The moment the heavy, unprecedented words were violently seared into his consciousness, the overwhelming presence vanished, leaving Muhammad alone in the dark, freezing silence of the high mountain. He was not filled with soaring divine confidence or joyful prophetic certainty. He was paralyzed by a visceral state of biological shock. In the superstitious, paranoid culture of 6th century Arabia, a man wandering alone in the high desert who suddenly heard booming voices did not assume he had been chosen by the creator of the universe. He assumed with cold, terrifying logic that he had lost his mind, or far worse, that he had been violently possessed by a jinn, a malevolent desert spirit that drove poets and soothsayers into permanent madness. The trustworthy merchant, the rational, respected logistical expert who had built his flawless reputation on mental clarity and rigorous honesty, was suddenly terrified that his own mind had been permanently shattered. He scrambled out of the narrow cave, his heart hammering with an irregular rhythm, and began a desperate, panicked, chaotic descent down the shadowed face of the mountain. He did not stop running until he reached the heavy, familiar wooden doors of his own home in the lower valley. Violently bursting into the quiet courtyard, drenched in cold sweat, shaking with uncontrollable tremor, he collapsed onto the floor before his wife, desperately, repeatedly begging her to cover him, to wrap him in heavy blankets, frantically trying to hide from the terrifying weight of the unseen universe that had rewritten his reality. And this is exactly where the profound strategic brilliance of Khadijah altered the trajectory of human history, providing the non-negotiable psychological anchor that kept the new movement from collapsing into despair. She did not panic, she did not treat him like a madman, and she did not dismiss his terrifying, detailed account of the crushing pressure in the cave as a mere fever dream. Instead, Khadijah listened to his desperate, trembling confession, and then systematically, brilliantly deployed cold, rational logic to deconstruct his paralyzing fear of demonic possession. She looked directly at her terrified husband and explicitly used his own flawless, decades-long track record of moral integrity as empirical, undeniable proof of his sanity. She firmly declared that the supreme creator of the universe would never humiliate or abandon a man who strictly kept his family ties, who consistently carried the financial burdens of the weak, who generously hosted the traveler, and who always, without fail, spoke the truth. She essentially told him that a lifetime of unyielding justice was the ultimate defense against madness, legally and morally reasoning that the heavy burden he had just received was not a curse, but a massive validation of his character. But Khadija, possessing the sophisticated macro perspective of a wealthy international merchant, knew that she needed more than personal intuition to comprehend the terrifying implications of what had just occurred in the high desert. She immediately took Muhammad out of the house, leading him through the dusty, crowded streets of Mecca to seek the specialized historical counsel of her elderly, blind cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal. Waraka was a respected, isolated scholar who had abandoned the polytheistic idolatry of the Quraysh years earlier, dedicating his life to meticulously translating the ancient Christian Gospels and the Torah into Arabic. When the young, traumatized merchant sat before the old, blind scholar and quietly, carefully recounted the terrifying sequence of crushing pressure and heavy words in the cave, Waraka did not exhibit the slightest trace of doubt or confusion. The blind scholar recognized the precise, specific historical signature of the encounter instantly, bypassing the localized, fragmented superstitions of the Arabian desert to connect the event to an overarching geopolitical and theological continuity. Waraka declared with heavy certainty that the overwhelming presence in the cave was the Namus, the great burdened keeper of secrets, the exact same divine emissary that had descended upon Moses on Mount Sinai centuries earlier. He explicitly confirmed that Muhammad had not lost his mind, but had instead been chosen as the final prophet for his people, carrying the exact same heavy, paradigm-shifting law that had previously toppled the ancient pharaohs of Egypt. But having confirmed the profound, sacred nature of the revelation, Waraka immediately delivered a massive, sobering geopolitical warning that shattered any illusion of a peaceful transition. The old scholar leaned forward, his blind eyes staring past the young man, and quietly heavily wished that he were a younger man, so that he could fiercely defend Muhammad on the inevitable day when his own people would violently drive him out of the city. Muhammad, the respected, successful merchant who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, who had successfully mediated the armed crisis of the Black Stone, was genuinely shocked. He asked Waraka, with unfeigned disbelief, if his own people, the very society that had proudly granted him the title of the trustworthy, would truly violently expel him from his own home. Waraka explicitly, analytically explained the brutal mathematics of human history, stating that no man has ever brought the specific, unyielding truth that Muhammad was now carrying without being subjected to organized, lethal hostility. The old scholar understood exactly what the young merchant was only just beginning to realize, that the heavy words delivered in the cave were not merely a private, quiet path to personal spiritual enlightenment. They were an aggressive, non-negotiable declaration of war against the foundational architecture of the entire global order. To fully grasp the existential threat that this new revelation posed to the merchant lords of Mecca, you must analyze the disruptive economic implications of pure monotheism. The entrenched lucrative power of the Quraysh, derived from maintaining a fragmented, managed pantheon of 360 different tribal idols within the neutral sanctuary of the Kaaba. This complex, cynical web of localized deities allowed elite merchants to broker profitable trade agreements with dozens of distinct, aggressive Bedouin tribes, acting as the indispensable, compensated middlemen of the desert. If Muhammad walked into the center of the bustling, profitable market and publicly declared La ilaha illallah, that there is no God but the one single unseen creator of the universe. He was not just initiating a polite theological debate. He was actively legally invalidating the existence of all 360 idols, destroying the complex, profitable web of tribal alliances, and explicitly threatening to vaporize the guarded tourism economy of the city overnight. Furthermore, the concept of a single, universal, unbribable creator mathematically leveled the stratified, exploited social hierarchy of the ancient world. If there is only one sovereign authority in the universe, then the wealthy, armed merchant lord sitting in his shaded courtyard is equal in value to the starving, vulnerable Abyssinian slave cleaning his floors. This was not a mild, peaceful philosophy. It was a radical, explosive socio-economic sledgehammer, designed to smash the unyielding arrogance of ancient aristocracies into dust. The revelation demanded uncompromising justice, the immediate eradication of usury and exploitative debt, the fierce protection of orphans and widows, and the total surrender of human ego to a higher, unseen law. Muhammad walked out of the house of the blind scholar carrying a burden so massive, so heavy, that it guaranteed the permanent destruction of the quiet, comfortable life he had spent decades building. He knew, with terrifying clarity, that the moment he opened his mouth and publicly shared the heavy words given to him in the cave, the merchant lords would instantly view him as a toxic threat to their profit margins. And for an agonizing, stressful period immediately following that first encounter, a period known as the Fatra, the overwhelming presence disappeared, and the heavy voice from the unseen universe went silent. For months, Muhammad climbed back up the jagged, unforgiving rocks of the mountain, sitting in the dark, empty cave, terrified that the creator of the universe had abandoned him, or that his initial fear of madness had been correct. This agonizing period of silence served a specific necessary psychological purpose, proving to Muhammad that he could not generate control or summon the heavy words through his own intellectual will. He was not a poet composing verses, and he was not an ambitious politician crafting a calculated manifesto. He was merely a vulnerable, overwhelmed human vessel waiting for a command from outside the boundaries of human reality. When the heavy silence was finally broken by the return of the overwhelming presence, the nature of the command shifted from private revelation to public duty. The heavy words descended again, explicitly commanding him to arise and warn, to abandon the quiet, isolated safety of his private life, and to step directly into the armed, dangerous center of the public arena. The trustworthy merchant, stripped of his anonymity and burdened by the weight of the universe, stood up from his heavy blankets, aware that the inevitable, destructive collision with the core power of the Quraysh was now unavoidable. The quiet, intellectual preparation in the shadows of the mountain was permanently over, and the brutal, organized economic retaliation of the Mecca elite was about to be unleashed with terrifying precision. When a man decides to publicly dismantle the foundational architecture of an entire global economy, he does not begin by whispering in the shadows. He climbs to the highest, most visible point in the city and forces the elite to look him directly in the eye. 3 years after the crushing, terrifying revelation in the cave, Muhammad finally broke the quiet, secretive phase of his early mission and initiated a calculated public confrontation. He walked deliberately out of his home, navigated the bustling, crowded streets surrounding the Kaaba, and climbed the rocky, elevated slope of Mount Safa, a prominent hill that physically overlooked the massive courtyard of the sanctuary. Standing above the noise of the market, he projected his voice using a specific, urgent traditional call, an ancient Arabian alarm reserved for warning the city of an imminent, massive military attack. The leaders of the Quraysh, hearing this serious, alarming signal from a man whose reputation for honesty was universally recognized, immediately dropped their ledgers, abandoned their trade negotiations, and rushed to the base of the hill. Muhammad looked down at the assembled, powerful patriarchs of the Meccan clans and asked them a logical, strategic question, inquiring if they would believe him if he told them a massive cavalry force was hiding behind the mountain preparing to attack. The merchant lords, relying entirely on his flawless, decades-long track record of transparency, unanimously replied that they had never known him to speak a single lie, fully validating his credibility before the entire city. Having perfectly, logically secured their admission of his integrity, Muhammad immediately delivered the massive geopolitical shockwave, declaring that he was a warner sent to save them from a terrifying divine judgment. He explicitly called upon each specific clan by name, dismantling the entrenched arrogance of their bloodlines, explicitly warning them that their massive wealth and their aristocratic ancestry would not save them from the unseen creator. The immediate reaction from the merchant lords was not a polite theological debate. It was a sudden, visceral explosion of aggressive hostility, led immediately by his own uncle, Abu Lahab, who loudly cursed him and demanded the crowd disperse. Abu Lahab and the other oligarchs did not react with such intense, immediate fury because they were offended by the abstract, philosophical concept of a single God. They reacted because they instantly, perfectly understood the devastating economic mathematics of Muhammad's declaration. To the ruling elite of the Quraysh, the 360 idols housed within the heavy stone walls of the Kaaba were not merely spiritual icons. They were the exact, engineered financial mechanism that guaranteed regional supremacy. Every single year, massive lucrative trade fairs like the market of Ukaz were directly tied to the religious pilgrimage seasons, drawing thousands of armed Bedouin tribesmen into the neutral sanctuary of Mecca to worship their specific, localized deities. If the city officially adopted the radical, uncompromising concept of pure monotheism, declaring that all 360 idols were useless blocks of wood and stone, the complex, profitable web of Bedouin alliances would instantly, violently collapse. The tribes would abandon the pilgrimage, the massive influx of foreign silver would evaporate, and the delicate, strategic neutral zone that allowed Mecca to function as the Wall Street of the ancient Middle East would be permanently destroyed. The men who ran the city, specifically a brilliant, ruthless, pragmatic leader named Ammar ibn Hisham, whom the Muslims would later grimly title Abu Jahl, or the father of ignorance, recognized that Muhammad was an existential threat to their profit margins. Abu Jahl was not a mindless, violent thug. He was a sophisticated, calculating geopolitical strategist who understood that a movement demanding unyielding social equality would vaporize the stratified, exploited labor force of the city. The elite initially attempted to neutralize this massive threat not through immediate violence, but through civilized, transactional mechanics of high-level aristocratic bribery. They sent a delegation of senior negotiators directly to Muhammad's protective uncle, Abi Talib, offering a massive, unprecedented political compromise to permanently silence his nephew. They explicitly offered to make Muhammad the wealthiest man in the entire city, to grant him the highest political authority within the Dar al-Nadwa Council, and even to crown him as their king, provided he simply ceased publicly insulting their idols. Muhammad, rejecting the corrupt transactional logic of the merchant lords, delivered a response so unyielding, so fundamental, uncompromising, that it shattered any illusion of a negotiated settlement. He looked at his exhausted, stressed uncle and declared that even if they placed the sun in his right hand and the moon in his left hand, he would never abandon his mission until it prevailed or he perished in the attempt. This total refusal to be bought exhausted the diplomatic patience of the Quraysh, forcing Abu Jahl and the oligarchs to officially shift their strategy from political containment to organized, systematic physical violence. But the complex, Rigidly enforced tribal laws of Mecca prevented them from simply assassinating Muhammad, because he was still technically legally protected by the massive, respected bloodline of the Banu Hashim clan under Abu Talib. If Abu Jahl ordered a direct strike on Muhammad, it would instantly trigger a devastating civil war between the clans, destroying the neutral sanctuary that generated their wealth. So Abu Jahl engineered a calculated, cowardly strategy of asymmetric warfare, deliberately choosing to bypass the protected aristocracy and focus concentrated state violence directly onto the weakest, most exposed members of the new movement. The early followers of Islam were not armed warlords. They were the vulnerable, marginalized underclass of the city, the indebted youth, the unprotected widows, and the massive population of foreign slaves who possessed no tribal protection whatsoever. The elites systematically authorized the heads of each respective household to violently, mercilessly torture the converts within their own families and their own slave quarters, immunizing themselves from the threat of intertribal blood feuds. This targeted, brutally efficient strategy of domestic terrorism was most violently, spectacularly demonstrated in the harrowing, historical ordeal of an Abyssinian slave named Bilal ibn Rabah. Bilal was a tall, resilient man entirely owned by a massive, arrogant merchant lord named Umayyah ibn Khalaf, a man who viewed the concept of a slave demanding spiritual equality as an unforgivable insult to the natural order. When Umayyah discovered that Bilal had quietly embraced the monotheistic message, he did not simply punish him in the privacy of his own courtyard. He orchestrated a public, theatrical demonstration of physical dominance intended to terrify the entire city into submission. He ordered his guards to drag the enslaved man out into the searing, unforgiving midday heat of the open desert valley, physically pinning him down onto the burning, scorched sand. Umayyah then ordered his men to hoist a massive heavy boulder and place it directly onto the chest of the exhausted, dehydrated man, physically crushing his ribs and slowly, agonizingly restricting his ability to breathe. The merchant lord stood over his victim in the blinding sun, explicitly demanding that Bilal renounce his belief in the single creator and publicly declare his submission to Lat and Uzza, the primary pagan idols of the Quraysh. But Bilal, stripped of every single physical defense, enduring a level of biological agony designed to break the human psyche, deployed the only weapon he had left, a massive, unyielding psychological defiance. He refused to scream, he refused to beg for mercy, and he refused to utter the names of the idols, simply repeating a single heavy Arabic word with every agonizing, shallow breath he could manage to draw. Ahad, Ahad, he whispered, meaning the one, reducing the complex theological debate of the city into a single, unbreakable mathematical absolute that shattered the arrogant authority of his tormentor. This public visible act of defiance infuriated Umayyah, but it also clearly demonstrated to the watching city that the armed merchant lords were incapable of controlling the internal, spiritual geography of their own slaves. The physical torture of Bilal only ended when Abu Bakr, a wealthy, respected merchant who had secretly become one of Muhammad's closest allies, executed a brilliant, subversive economic maneuver. Abu Bakr walked directly into the blinding heat of the desert, confronted the frustrated Umayyah, and publicly offered to purchase the half-dead slave for an exorbitant, inflated amount of silver that no rational merchant could possibly refuse. Umayyah, blinded by his own toxic greed and eager to salvage a massive profit from a broken asset, sneered and accepted the silver, mocking Abu Bakr for paying such a massive price for a useless slave. But Abu Bakr, immediately upon securing the legal contract of ownership, bypassed the heavy, exploitative logic of the Meccan economy by legally, publicly declaring Bilal a free man, severing the chains of his servitude. This specific, strategic act of purchasing and freeing tortured slaves became a massive, effective countermeasure deployed by the wealthier Muslims, systematically using their own capital to quietly dismantle the economic foundation of the persecution. Abu Jahl, observing the failure of localized individual torture to stop the quiet, steady expansion of the movement, realized that he needed a systemic weapon to crush the entire Banu Hashim clan. He recognized that as long as Abu Talib continued to extend his heavy, uncompromising tribal protection over Muhammad, the physical assassination of the Prophet remained a dangerous logistical impossibility. So the leaders of the Quraysh convened a massive secretive emergency session within the Dar al-Nadwa and engineered a sweeping, unprecedented policy of socio-economic warfare. They drafted a heavy, legally binding document instituting a total economic and social blockade against the entire Banu Hashim clan, regardless of whether the individual members of the clan were Muslims or practicing polytheists. The terms of the boycott were merciless, explicitly forbidding any citizen of Mecca from buying goods from the Banu Hashim, selling them food, or engaging in any form of intermarriage with their families. To ensure strict enforcement of this starvation campaign, they wrote the terms on a heavy piece of parchment, sealed it with the crests of the ruling elite, and physically hung the document deep inside the dark, protected interior of the Kaaba. The entire Banu Hashim clan, isolated and intimidated by the overwhelming military and economic power of the allied merchant lords, was physically forced to evacuate their homes in the bustling center of the city. They were driven into a desolate, unlivable, narrow, rocky ravine on the outskirts of Mecca, an area historically known as the Sheib Abi Talib. For 3 long, agonizing, devastating years, the entire extended family of the Prophet was essentially trapped in an open-air prison camp, cut off from the lucrative supply chains that fed the city. The logistics of starvation in a barren desert valley are swift and brutal. When the seasonal caravans arrived from Syria and Yemen carrying massive shipments of grain, wheat, and vital supplies, Abu Jahl deployed armed guards to the markets, explicitly threatening violence against any merchant who attempted to sell even a handful of dates to the starving clan. The price of black market food, quietly smuggled into the ravine under the cover of darkness, skyrocketed to impossible, extortionate levels, draining the vast, previously unassailable personal fortunes of Khadijah and Abu Bakr in a matter of months. The historical accounts of this period abandon any sense of poetic romance, detailing the stark, horrifying reality of wealthy, educated aristocrats physically reduced to boiling dry leather and eating the tough, bitter leaves of the thorny acacia bushes just to survive malnutrition. The quiet, disturbing cries of starving, emaciated children echoing out of the dark, rocky ravine could be heard clearly in the bustling, brightly lit markets of Mecca, casting a heavy, profound moral shadow over the entire city. Yet despite the mind-numbing biological agony of starvation, Abu Talib, who never personally abandoned the polytheistic religion of his ancestors, maintained an unbroken, heroic commitment to the ancient Bedouin codes of tribal protection. He ordered his men to constantly, quietly shift Muhammad's sleeping position every single night within the camp, terrified that the armed assassins of the Quraysh would use the darkness to slip past the blockade and violently end the standoff. The sheer, unyielding endurance of the Banu Hashim and the horrifying sound of starving children slowly began to fracture the managed, carefully constructed political unity of the Quraysh. Several prominent, conflicted Meccan leaders who had close blood relatives suffering inside the ravine began to secretly undermine the boycott, risking their own lives and massive fortunes to load camels with heavy sacks of grain and quietly drive them into the valley under the cover of the new moon. A quietly organized, subversive political resistance began to form among a small group of rational, empathetic Meccan oligarchs, led by a respected statesman named Mutim ibn Adi, who viewed the systematic starvation of their own bloodlines as an unforgivable stain on the honor of the city. Mutim gathered an armed coalition of 5 dissenting clan leaders, marched directly into the crowded courtyard of the Kaaba, and publicly, loudly declared that the unjust, weaponized boycott was null and void. When Abu Jahl fiercely, aggressively protested this sudden, coordinated political rebellion, Mutim ordered his men to physically enter the sacred interior of the Kaaba to retrieve the heavy parchment document and publicly tear it to pieces. But when they unlocked the heavy wooden doors and brought the document out into the blinding sunlight, they discovered a strange, symbolic, undeniable physical reality. The heavy parchment had been aggressively devoured by a massive infestation of desert termites, leaving nothing of the detailed, cruel legal contract except for the very first line, which read, "In your name, O God." The discovery shattered the psychological resolve of the hardliners, forcing Abu Jahl to reluctantly, furiously accept the collapse of his massive socio-economic blockade. The Banu Hashim, exhausted, emaciated, and financially ruined, slowly walked out of the rocky ravine, returning to their neglected, dusty homes in the lower valley. Muhammad had survived the concentrated, weaponized economic assault the Quraysh could possibly mount, proving that the unseen fabric of the new community could withstand the ultimate biological pressure of starvation. But the 3 years of relentless malnutrition, constant exposure to the freezing desert nights, and crushing psychological stress of the siege had inflicted a permanent, devastating toll on the physical bodies of the elder generation. The unyielding biological bill for their survival was about to come due, and the cost would strip Muhammad of every single remaining piece of geopolitical and emotional armor he possessed. The fragile, localized victory of surviving the ravine was about to be instantly overshadowed by an era defined by profound devastation that history would forever remember by the heavy weight of its grief. He had walked out of the valley alive, but the 2 massive, irreplaceable pillars that supported the entire architecture of his existence were quietly, undeniably preparing to collapse. When the physical siege of the rocky ravine finally collapsed, the surviving members of the Banu Hashim clan walked back into the bustling, brightly lit streets of Mecca, unaware that the true cost of their endurance had not yet been fully extracted. Muhammad had successfully kept the political and spiritual core of his community intact throughout the blockade, but the victory was profoundly Pyrrhic. Khadija, the brilliant, sophisticated aristocratic merchant who had voluntarily liquidated her entire massive commercial empire to purchase inflated black market grain for the starving families, was broken by the siege. She was nearly 65 years old, stripped of the luxurious, protected environment she had commanded for decades, and her physical constitution rapidly failed in the immediate aftermath of the boycott. In the year 619, shortly after returning to her depleted home in the lower valley, the most powerful independent female investor in the history of the city succumbed to the accumulated physical trauma of the blockade. Her death did not just remove Muhammad's profound, irreplaceable emotional anchor. It permanently obliterated the massive, fortified wall of financial leverage that had shielded him from the aggressive debt cycles of the city. She had been the very first human being to validate his sanity in the terrifying aftermath of the cave, pouring her unyielding belief and her vast unassailable fortune into the foundations of the movement. But the brutal, efficient geopolitical machinery of Mecca did not pause to respect his profound personal grief, because the same biological toll that claimed his wife was rapidly eroding his legal protection. His uncle Abu Talib, the aging, honorable patriarch of the Banu Hashim clan who had fiercely stood between his nephew and the armed assassins of the Quraysh for an entire decade, was also dying. Abu Talib was a man who had sacrificed his clan's economic standing, enduring the agonizing, humiliating starvation of the ravine. Out of ancient Bedouin commitment to blood loyalty, he never embraced the monotheistic theology of his nephew, remaining firmly committed to the ancient polytheistic traditions of his ancestors until the very last moments of his fading life. Historical records document a tense, politically charged final standoff at the deathbed of the patriarch, where Abu Jahl and the elite oligarchs of the city gathered to ensure that the dying chief did not legally, spiritually validate the new religion. They stood over the exhausted old man, loudly demanding that he swear his final allegiance to the religion of his forefathers, terrified that a deathbed conversion would retroactively legitimize Muhammad's entire geopolitical movement. Abu Talib yielded to the immense, entrenched social pressure of his aristocratic peers, dying upon the pagan faith of the Quraysh, a tragic, agonizing personal failure for Muhammad, who had desperately begged his uncle to simply whisper the declaration of one God. But the true catastrophic disaster of Abu Talib's death was not spiritual. It was a swift legal and political decapitation of Muhammad's position within the city. Under the rigid mechanics of tribal law, the leadership of the Banu Hashim clan immediately passed to the next senior male in the bloodline, a man named Abu Lahab. Abu Lahab was not merely an indifferent relative. He was Muhammad's most vicious political enemy, a man invested in the lucrative idol trade who had spent the last decade actively attempting to humiliate and destroy the monotheistic movement. The new patriarch immediately utilized a brilliant, cynical legal maneuver to strip Muhammad of his citizenship, bypassing the deep tribal taboo against abandoning a blood relative. Abu Lahab publicly demanded that Muhammad explicitly state the current spiritual location of their deceased, polytheistic grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, knowing perfectly well that the rigid theology of Islam condemned all polytheists to hellfire. When Muhammad refused to compromise his theological principles to politically appease his uncle, stating the harsh, unyielding truth of the monotheistic doctrine, Abu Lahab instantly seized the opportunity. He loudly, publicly declared that a man who insulted the eternal soul of their revered patriarch could no longer be considered a legitimate member of the Banu Hashim clan. With that single calculated political decree, the legal protection of Jawar, the tribal sanctuary that kept a man from being murdered in the streets, was permanently revoked. Muhammad was instantly rendered legally stateless, effectively transforming him into an outlaw, an unprotected target who could be assassinated by any member of the Quraysh without triggering retaliatory blood feuds. The trustworthy merchant, the man who had flawlessly managed massive international supply chains and prevented a catastrophic civil war over the Black Stone, was now trapped in a city where his very existence was illegal. He realized with cold, pragmatic geopolitical clarity that the monotheistic movement could not survive if it remained localized within the hostile, armed jurisdiction of Mecca. He desperately needed to secure a new sovereign sanctuary, a physical territory governed by a powerful armed tribe that would legally extend political asylum and military protection to his vulnerable followers. Operating under deep secrecy to avoid the watchful spies of Abu Jahl, Muhammad made a desperate, calculated tactical pivot toward the east. He quietly slipped out of Mecca, accompanied only by his freed slave and adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha, and began an exhausting physical journey across the jagged, sun-blasted mountains to the fortified city of Taif. Taif was not a minor desert outpost. It was a massive strategic agricultural center located high in the cooler, fertile mountain ranges, functioning as the primary summer retreat and agricultural breadbasket for the wealthy elite of Mecca. The city was entirely controlled by the powerful Thaqif tribe, a massive armed confederation that historically rivaled the Quraysh in military strength but remained integrated into Mecca's economic supply chains. Muhammad approached the three supreme aristocratic brothers who ruled the Thaqif tribe, attempting to negotiate an unprecedented geopolitical alliance. He explicitly requested that they legally grant him political sanctuary, absorb his followers into their protective network, and militarily align with him against the corrupt, abusive merchant lords of the Quraysh. But the Thaqif warlords were sophisticated, calculating economic pragmatists who understood the political liability of harboring the most wanted fugitive in the Arabian Peninsula. They realized that backing Muhammad would instantly trigger a devastating economic embargo by the Quraysh, severing the lucrative agricultural trade routes that sustained their city's wealth. Furthermore, the Thaqif worshipped their own profitable local idol named Al-Lat, and they instantly recognized that Muhammad's uncompromising demand for pure monotheism would ultimately require the destruction of their own tourism revenue. The warlords did not just diplomatically decline his request for an alliance. They executed an organized, public rejection designed to signal loyalty to the merchant lords of Mecca. They deliberately avoided bloodying their own hands, instead commanding the city's slaves, street urchins, and working-class laborers to violently drive the unprotected prophet out of their territory. Muhammad and Zayd were chased through the dusty, narrow streets of the city by an aggressive mob, relentlessly pelted with jagged stones that tore through their leather sandals and lacerated their legs. Bleeding heavily, exhausted, and humiliated by the catastrophic failure of his diplomatic mission, Muhammad retreated several miles outside the city walls, finally collapsing in the shaded shelter of an isolated vineyard. The historical, authentic minor plot that unfolded within this vineyard illustrates the complex, contradictory nature of Arabian aristocratic politics. The vineyard was not abandoned. It was privately owned by two wealthy Meccan oligarchs named Utbah and Shayba, men who opposed Muhammad's religious message in the council of the Dar al-Nadwa, but watching the respected, unprotected man bleeding in their garden. Ancient ingrained Bedouin codes of basic human hospitality overrode their immediate political hostility. They did not order their guards to finish the assassination. They instead quietly dispatched an educated Christian slave named Adas to carry a small wooden bowl of freshly picked grapes to the bleeding fugitive. When Adas presented the grapes, he was shocked to hear the exhausted man mutter the phrase Bismillah, in the name of God, before eating. A monotheistic phrase, alien to the polytheistic culture of the Arabian Peninsula. A tense theological conversation immediately sparked between the bleeding prophet and the enslaved Christian, revealing that Adas was originally from the ancient historical city of Nineveh in Mesopotamia. Muhammad immediately recognized the city as the home of the ancient prophet Jonah, a specific piece of historical knowledge that baffled the slave, as no unlettered Arabian merchant could know the history of the Hebrew prophets. Adas dropped to his knees, kissing the bleeding head, hands, and feet of the exhausted man, recognizing the undeniable presence of a true prophet, much to the visible disgust of his aristocratic Meccan masters, watching from a distance. This brief, specific encounter in the vineyard provided crucial, necessary psychological validation for Muhammad at the lowest, most defeated moment of his geopolitical career. It logically proved that while the arrogant warlords of the Arabian Peninsula were blinded by their own economic interests, the universal message of monotheism still held power to penetrate the hearts of the exploited underclass. But the spiritual validation of a single foreign slave did not solve the terrifying logistical nightmare of Muhammad's immediate physical survival. He stood in the open desert, rejected by the Thaqif tribe, and barred from re-entering his own home city of Mecca after Abu Lahab stripped him of his citizenship. If he simply walked back through the mountain passes into the lower valley of the Quraysh, Any armed merchant could legally assassinate him in broad daylight without facing legal consequence from the city council. He was trapped in the lethal void of statelessness, cut off from his terrified family, loyal followers, and the fundamental supply lines necessary for his survival. Operating from an exposed cave on the outskirts of Meccan territory, he quietly dispatched secret runners into the city, attempting tense, high-stakes diplomatic negotiations to secure a temporary tribal sponsor. He sent urgent messages to several prominent, respected non-Muslim clan leaders, asking if they would legally extend tribal protection over him to allow his return home. The first two leaders he approached immediately refused, terrified of triggering a destructive political war with the faction led by Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab. Finally, the desperate request reached the fortified courtyard of Mutim ibn Adi the Principled, honorable pagan statesman who had led the armed rebellion to tear up the boycott document 3 years earlier. Mutim did not believe in an unseen god. He worshipped the stone idols of the Kaaba, but he held firm commitment to ancient, rigorous Arabian codes of honor and sanctuary. He viewed the legal abandonment of a prominent Meccan citizen by his own bloodline as an unforgivable structural failure of the city's justice system. Mutim formally agreed to extend the armed protection of his own clan, the Banu Nawfal, over the hunted prophet, defying the hostile political consensus of the ruling elite. The physical re-entry into the city was a theatrical, tense display of overwhelming paramilitary force designed to deter opportunistic assassination attempts by the hardliners. Mutim ordered his 6 armored adult sons to surround Muhammad in a tight, disciplined protective formation, marching him through the aggressive center of the bustling market. They walked deliberately into the open courtyard of the Kaaba, where the elite merchant lords sat in the shade, and Mutim loudly announced to the entire city that Muhammad was now under his legal protection. Abu Jahl, sitting among the oligarchs, furiously accepted the new reality, knowing attacking the convoy would trigger a devastating blood feud with the armed Banu Nawfal clan. Muhammad had survived the lethal exposure of the desert, but the fragile, temporary nature of Mutim's pagan protection signaled that his time in Mecca was ending. He could no longer preach freely. He could no longer recruit the vulnerable underclass. And his survival depended on the volatile political moods of a man who rejected his theology. The devastating year of sorrow had stripped the movement of its wealth, its aristocratic shield, and its illusion that Mecca could be reformed through peaceful diplomacy. The unforgiving geopolitical reality was clear. The monotheistic movement was a landless, persecuted faction operating within the hostile borders of an enemy state. If the community intended to survive the coordinated economic and physical extermination campaign of the Quraysh, they required a permanent, defensible, sovereign base of operations. Muhammad shifted his strategic macroeconomic perspective away from Mecca's consolidated power structure, looking outward toward the chaotic network of oasis settlements scattered across the desert. He began systematically analyzing the fractured political fault lines of neighboring cities, searching for a society broken by internal violence that would welcome a disciplined foreign arbitrator. The search for sanctuary was no longer a matter of finding a quiet place to pray. It was the urgent pursuit of sovereign territory, the fundamental requirement for the birth of a new empire. And nearly 300 miles to the north, hidden beneath a sprawling canopy of lucrative date palms, a fractured, violent city was fading, unaware that the architect of its salvation was confined within the walls of Mecca. Roughly 300 miles north of the barren, sun-scorched valley of Mecca, the geographic and economic reality of the Arabian Peninsula undergoes a stark, structural transformation. The city of Yathrib was not a centralized merchant republic built around a single sacred sanctuary. It was a sprawling, decentralized agricultural oasis dominated by vast, irrigated groves of date palms. Unlike the Quraysh, who accumulated liquid wealth by moving foreign goods across vast distances, the inhabitants of Yathrib extracted their physical survival directly from the volcanic soil. This fundamental economic difference dictated an entirely different, volatile political architecture. Farming requires fixed territory, complex irrigation canals, and fortified stone watchtowers to protect the seasonal harvest from nomadic raiding parties. Because property lines were permanent and resources were strictly localized, minor disputes over water rights or boundary markers rarely ended in polite commercial arbitration. They frequently escalated into lethal, multi-generational blood feuds that locked neighboring farms into perpetual cycles of retaliation. By the early 7th century, the demographic map of the oasis was a complex, fragile web divided among two major pagan Arab tribes, the Aws and the Khazraj, and three prominent Jewish tribes, the Banu Nadir, the Banu Kenuka, and the Banu Qurayza. For decades, the Jewish tribes had dominated the local economy, controlling the weapons manufacturing, the jewelry trade, and the financing of the agricultural yields through strict, interest-bearing loans. The pagan Arab tribes, indebted and fiercely territorial, frequently allied with the different Jewish factions, essentially transforming the oasis into a web of armed, mutually hostile military alliances. Around the year 617, this tense geopolitical equilibrium collapsed during a catastrophic, full-scale civil war known as the Battle of Bu'ath. The Aws and the Khazraj, supported by their respective Jewish allies, engaged in a mutual slaughter of terrifying scale that wiped out the senior leadership of both Arab tribes. The battle did not result in a clear victor. It merely produced a paralyzed, traumatized society drained of its martial strength and economic vitality. The surviving population was terrified of triggering another massacre. Yet they possessed no central authority, no police force, and no judicial system capable of enforcing a lasting truce. In ancient Arabian culture, when a society reached a state of total, irreconcilable systemic deadlock, the only legal mechanism to prevent mutual annihilation was to import an outside arbitrator known as a hakam. The hakam had to be a man of unassailable moral integrity, possessing no blood ties to any of the warring factions. Granting him neutrality required to issue binding, objective, legal verdicts. The remaining leaders of Yathrib began desperately searching the Arabian Peninsula for a figure possessing the specific, rare combination of diplomatic genius and neutrality necessary to save their city from itself. Meanwhile, back in the hostile jurisdiction of Mecca, Muhammad was systematically leveraging the one logistical vulnerability that the Quraysh could not seal: the sacred months of pilgrimage. During these specific months, tribal violence was strictly outlawed across the peninsula, allowing Muhammad to safely exit the protective walls of Mutim ibn Adi's compound and physically approach the foreign Bedouin camps ringing the city. He walked among the tents of the visiting pilgrims, quietly presenting his monotheistic message and explicitly seeking a political alliance capable of sheltering his persecuted followers. For years, he was repeatedly, aggressively rejected by the nomadic warlords, who saw no strategic advantage in adopting a religion that would instantly sever their lucrative trade contracts with the Quraysh. But in the summer of 620, near a rocky outpost outside Mecca called Mina, Muhammad approached a small campfire surrounded by 6 exhausted men from the Khazraj tribe of Yathrib. He sat down, offered a peaceful greeting, and began to recite the precise rhythmic verses of the Quran, dismantling the logic of idol worship and demanding submission to a single creator. The reaction of the 6 men from Yathrib was not the usual aristocratic mockery of the Quraysh, but a sudden, striking realization rooted in the unique sociological makeup of their home city. Because the Khazraj shared an oasis with 3 powerful Jewish tribes, They were intimately familiar with the theological concept of a single unseen God, written scriptures, and the concept of divine law. More importantly, the Jewish tribes, when engaged in bitter commercial disputes with the pagan Arabs, frequently warned the Khazraj that a new prophet was prophesied to arrive soon, and that the Jews would follow him to utterly destroy the pagans. As Muhammad spoke, the 6 Khazrajites quietly exchanged glances across the campfire, rapidly connecting the complex theological warnings of their Jewish neighbors with the physical reality of the man sitting before them. Operating with a swift, predatory political pragmatism, they realized that if they accepted his authority first, they could politically outmaneuver the Jewish tribes and secure the prophesied leader for their own alliance. Furthermore, they recognized that an outsider possessing direct, unassailable divine authority was the ultimate candidate to serve as the Hakam, the neutral arbitrator required to stop the bleeding in their ruined oasis. They did not possess the authority to commit their entire city to a military alliance on the spot, but they swore an initial oath of belief and promised to return to Yathrib to quietly test the political waters. Muhammad, possessing the tactical patience honed by decades of commercial logistics, understood that an entire society cannot be structurally transformed in a single evening. He allowed the 6 men to return north, planting a vital, quiet seed of diplomacy in fertile, traumatized soil, and waited an entire year to see if the fragile diplomatic thread would hold. The following summer, during the next pilgrimage season, the thread did not just hold. It returned significantly reinforced. 12 men from Yathrib arrived at a secret, prearranged meeting point in the narrow valley of Aqaba, under the cover of night to avoid the roaming security patrols of the Quraysh. This delegation included representatives from both the Khazraj and their bitter blood rivals, the AWS, visually proving to Muhammad that his message possessed the exact chemical property required to dissolve ancient tribal hatreds. They executed a formal, legally binding contract known to history as the First Pledge of Aqaba, or the Pledge of Women, because it did not yet involve a mutual defense pact or an obligation to wage war. They swore to worship only one God, to abandon the practices of theft and infanticide, and to strictly obey Muhammad in matters of civic justice. But a pledge sworn in the dark outside Mecca meant nothing if the actual streets of Yathrib remained a hostile, fractured war zone incapable of safely receiving hundreds of desperate Meccan refugees. Muhammad needed rigorous, objective, on-the-ground intelligence to determine if the oasis was structurally sound enough to function as the sovereign capital of a new political state. He dispatched a brilliant, educated young patrician named Musazab ibn Umair to accompany the delegation back to Yathrib, essentially appointing the very first official ambassador of the Islamic State. Musazab was a former wealthy aristocrat who had abandoned his fortune to follow Muhammad, possessing flawless manners, eloquent speech, and tactical understanding of Arabian tribal psychology. His mission in Yathrib was not merely to teach the verses of the Quran. He was tasked with conducting a systematic, covert geopolitical audit of the entire oasis. Musazab spent the next 12 months navigating the fortified date farms, analyzing the water distribution networks, assessing the exact military strength of the Jewish and Arab factions, and methodically recruiting local leaders. He targeted the specific, pragmatic warlords who were exhausted by the endless blood feuds, presenting Islam not just as a spiritual remedy, but as a rigid, functional framework for civic law and order. He secured the conversions of critical, heavy-hitting tribal aristocrats like Sa'd ibn Mu'adij, a senior chieftain whose personal submission instantly brought his entire extended clan into the monotheistic fold. When the pilgrimage season of 622 arrived, Musazab returned to Mecca and delivered a comprehensive, flawless intelligence report directly to Muhammad. He confirmed that the logistical infrastructure of Yathrib could physically sustain a massive influx of Meccan refugees, and that the political climate was finally, decisively primed to accept Muhammad as sovereign executive of the city. The transition from persecuted religious community to an independent political state required one final, irreversible legal contract, a mutual defense treaty that would officially declare war against the existing global order. 73 men and 2 women from Yathrib traveled to Mecca, mixed within the massive, chaotic crowds of pagan pilgrims, meticulously maintaining their cover to avoid alerting the spies of Abu Jahl. They received secret instructions to wait until the middle third of the night, when the heavy heat of the valley broke and the city was asleep, and to quietly converge at the exact same rocky ravine of Aqaba. They were explicitly ordered not to wake anyone who was sleeping, not to wait for anyone who was late, and to move in small, scattered groups of 2 or 3 to avoid raising any visual suspicion in the moonlight. When the delegation finally assembled in the rocky darkness, they found Muhammad waiting for them. But he was not alone. He was accompanied by his uncle, Al-Abbas, a powerful, wealthy leader of the Banu Hashim clan who, crucially, was still a practicing polytheist and a fully integrated member of the Meccan elite. The presence of Al-Abbas at this clandestine meeting reveals the rigorous, fiercely pragmatic legal mechanics of ancient Bedouin statecraft. Al-Abbas was there acting as the official legal representative of Muhammad's bloodline, ensuring that the transfer of political custody from the Banu Hashim to the tribes of Yathrib was executed according to strict, non-negotiable diplomatic protocols. Al-Abbas stepped forward and addressed the men of Yathrib with cold, brutal clarity, stripping away any romantic illusions about the sheer gravity of what they were attempting to do. He stated that Muhammad was currently protected in his own city by his own family, and that if the men of Yathrib were not militarily prepared to defend him against the combined armies of the entire Arabian Peninsula, they should walk away immediately. Al-Abbas warned them that taking this man meant officially declaring war against the red and the black, an ancient idiom meaning the entire known world. The leaders of Yathrib did not flinch at the threat of total war. They were battle-hardened veterans of a ruined society who understood that true peace frequently requires the willingness to fight for it. Al-Bara ibn Marah, a senior chieftain of the delegation, grasped Muhammad's hand and declared that they were men of weapons, forged in warfare, and they were prepared to defend the Prophet precisely as they defended their own wives and children. But the delegates of Yathrib possessed their own sharp geopolitical instincts, and they required legal assurance that they were not simply being used as a temporary military convenience. Another chieftain spoke up in the darkness, pointing out that if they severed their alliances with the other Arab tribes to support Muhammad, and Muhammad subsequently gained ultimate victory over his enemies in Mecca, he might simply abandon them and return to his birthplace. Muhammad smiled in the shadows and delivered a response that dismantled their anxiety. Utilizing the binding language of blood allegiance, he stated, "Blood is blood and destruction is destruction. You are of me and I am of you. I will fight whomever you fight, and I will make peace with whomever you make peace." With that single ironclad verbal contract, the second pledge of Aqaba, historically known as the Pledge of War, was formally ratified. The 75 delegates stepped forward one by one in the dark, physically striking their palms against Muhammad's hand, swearing an oath of military protection, financial support, and unquestioning civic obedience. This clandestine ceremony was the literal birth of the Islamic State, the precise historical moment when the persecuted religious minority formally acquired a sovereign territory and a standing military force. The tension in the ravine was thick, a physical pressure because every single person standing in that rocky gorge knew that if a Meccan patrol discovered them, a massacre would commence before the sun even rose. Their fears were instantly validated when a loud, piercing voice suddenly echoed from the high ridges above the valley. A Meccan spy who had tracked their movements, shouting into the night to alert the sleeping Quraysh. The leaders of Yathrib immediately drew their swords, asking Muhammad for the order to rush the camps of the sleeping Meccan pilgrims and slaughter them in the dark to secure their escape. Muhammad, demonstrating flawless tactical discipline, explicitly ordered them to sheath their weapons and return quietly to their camps. Knowing that a chaotic nighttime skirmish would derail the meticulously planned extraction of his people, the delegation scattered into the darkness, blending back into the massive crowds of departing pilgrims the next morning, leaving Abu Jahl and the Quraysh leadership baffled by the rumors of a secret midnight treaty. But the merchants of Mecca were master intelligence gatherers, and within days their spies confirmed the stark truth of the alliance. The Quraysh realized that Muhammad had outmaneuvered them, bypassing their local economic boycott and securing a fortified, agriculturally independent military base sitting directly astride their primary northern trade route to Syria. If Muhammad successfully relocated to Yathrib, he would possess the geographic capability to choke off the commercial lifeline of Mecca, effectively transforming his religious movement into a lethal economic noose. The merchant lords understood that they had exhausted every single diplomatic, economic, and social weapon in their arsenal, leaving only one final option to prevent the destruction of their global trade monopoly. The targeted, synchronized, public assassination of Muhammad was no longer a risky political maneuver. It was a matter of immediate, desperate municipal survival. Abu Jahl convened the ultimate emergency session of the Dar al-Nadwa, ensuring that every single major clan was represented in the room, to engineer a murder so perfectly distributed that it would legally paralyze the Banu Hashim's ability to retaliate. The quiet, methodical preparation for the extraction of the vulnerable Meccan Muslims had already begun. Small family units slipping away into the harsh desert under the blazing sun, leaving their homes, their wealth, and their entire past behind them. But the architect of the migration remained deliberately inside the hostile walls of Mecca, staring down the concentrated, lethal conspiracy the city had ever produced, waiting for the exact logistical window to execute the most consequential escape in human history, to physically eliminate a man protected by a powerful Arabian bloodline without triggering a catastrophic, multi-generational civil war. You must distribute the guilt so perfectly that retaliation becomes a mathematical impossibility. This was the exact cynical geopolitical logic that Abu Jahl presented to the emergency session of the Dar al-Nadwa in the late summer of 622. The merchant lords of Mecca knew that the vast majority of Muhammad's followers had already successfully evacuated the city, quietly slipping away in small, vulnerable groups across the scorching desert toward the northern oasis of Yathrib. But the architect of this massive demographic shift remained deliberately inside his own heavily monitored home in Mecca, meticulously managing the complex logistics of the extraction before securing his own escape. Abu Jahl explicitly argued that if Muhammad successfully reached Yathrib, he would immediately consolidate the fractured tribes of the oasis into a sovereign military force positioned directly on Mecca's vital northern trade route. The solution Abu Jahl engineered was a masterpiece of cold, aristocratic pragmatism, designed to bypass the rigid tribal laws that had protected Muhammad for an entire decade. He demanded that every single prominent clan in the city select one young, capable warrior, arm them with heavy Damascus blades, and instruct them to strike the Prophet simultaneously in the dark. By ensuring that every single clan's blade tasted the blood of the target, Abu Jahl guaranteed that the Banu Hashim could not possibly declare war to avenge him, because declaring war against every tribe simultaneously meant total annihilation. The Banu Hashim would be legally, mathematically forced to accept a massive financial settlement of blood money. Neutralizing the political fallout of the assassination, and permanently securing the trade routes of the Quraysh. On the specific night chosen for the strike, a heavily armed hit squad silently surrounded Muhammad's small courtyard home, peering through the gaps in the door, waiting for the heavy, suffocating heat of the night to put the entire city to sleep. Inside the house, Muhammad was aware of the massive coordinated dragnet closing around him. Possessing accurate human intelligence regarding the precise timing and the specific lethal mechanics of the assassination, he executed a dangerous, calculated tactical decoy, leveraging the absolute, unquestioning loyalty of his young cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was fully aware of the massive physical risk he was assuming. Muhammad handed Ali his own distinct, heavy green cloak, instructing the young man to lie directly in his bed and pull the heavy fabric over his head, presenting the exact visual profile of the sleeping prophet to the assassins waiting outside. But before he quietly left the house, Muhammad gave Ali a specific, profoundly revealing secondary objective that illustrates the paradoxical nature of his reputation within the heavily hostile city. Even while the elite merchant lords were actively attempting to murder him, many of them still utilized Muhammad as their primary financial safe deposit, trusting his absolute integrity to hold their vast fortunes of silver and gold. He explicitly ordered Ali to remain in the city just long enough to personally, meticulously return every single deposited asset to the very men who were paying the assassins standing outside the door. Leaving the vulnerable decoy in the bed, Muhammad quietly slipped out of the house under the cover of deep darkness, utilizing a blind spot in the assassin's perimeter to bypass the heavily armed squad. He walked swiftly through the silent, dusty streets of the lower valley, avoiding the main thoroughfares, making his way to the heavily protected compound of Abu Bakr, the wealthy merchant who had quietly prepared the logistical assets for their extraction. Abu Bakr had already procured 2 resilient, exceptionally fast transport camels and had hired a brilliant, polytheistic Bedouin tracker named Abdullah ibn Urakit to physically guide them through the most desolate, untraveled routes of the deep desert. But Muhammad, operating with a flawless understanding of tracking logistics and aggressive Bedouin psychology, knew that simply fleeing directly north toward Yathrib would lead them straight into the path of the fast, motivated Meccan cavalry. Instead of heading north, Muhammad and Abu Bakr moved rapidly in the exact opposite direction, hiking miles directly south into the jagged, barren volcanic mountains surrounding the city. Climbing toward an isolated fissure known as the Cave of Hira, they intended to hide deep within this claustrophobic, hot stone crevice for 3 full days, explicitly waiting for the initial, massive explosion of Meccan panic to exhaust itself before attempting the long, exposed desert crossing. Back in Mecca, when the morning sun finally rose, the assassins violently breached the heavy wooden doors of the prophet's home, drawing their heavy blades and pulling back the green cloak, only to discover the young Ali staring calmly back at them. The psychological shock of the deception instantly triggered a massive, aggressive, citywide manhunt, with Abu Jahl furiously offering a staggering, unprecedented bounty of 100 red camels for the capture of Muhammad, dead or alive. This massive financial reward mobilized the most elite, skilled Bedouin trackers in the Hijaz. Men who could read the faint disturbances in the sand, the displaced pebbles, and the broken scrub brush with terrifying, absolute precision. On the 3rd day of the manhunt, a skilled tracking party followed the faint traces of 2 men directly up the jagged slopes of Mount Thor, standing heavily armed just inches outside the narrow opening of the cave. Inside the dark, suffocating space, Abu Bakr whispered in deep, absolute terror that if the men outside simply looked down at their own feet, they would instantly discover the fugitives and the movement would end in a bloody massacre on the mountain. Muhammad, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable psychological calm, turned to his terrified companion and quietly asked what he thought of two men who had the creator of the universe as their absolute unseen third. The historical accounts of this specific standoff detail a profoundly simple, organic physical barrier that short-circuited the logical trained minds of the Bedouin trackers. A desert spider had spun an intricate, unbroken web across the narrow entrance of the cave, and a rock dove had built a fragile nest directly on the ledge, resting undisturbed in the searing heat. The trackers, applying rigorous, absolute desert logic, concluded that no human being could have possibly entered the dark fissure without tearing the fragile silk or disturbing the nesting bird, dismissing the location and turning back down the mountain. It was a massive, consequential victory of simple biological architecture over elite military intelligence, allowing Muhammad and Abu Bakr to finally slip out of the cave under the cover of the third night without shedding a single drop of blood. They met their hired Bedouin guide, mounted the fast camels, and began a grueling, punishing physical journey, deliberately avoiding the established trade routes and riding hard through the most desolate, heavily scorched coastal terrain of the Red Sea. But the massive bounty of 100 red camels was a powerful economic magnet, drawing a fierce, experienced Bedouin bounty hunter named Suraka bin Malik directly onto their hidden, unmapped trail. Suraka possessed an incredibly fast horse, heavy armor, and a long lance, and he pushed his mount to the absolute limit of endurance, eventually catching visual sight of the fleeing riders in the shimmering, heavy heat distortion of the desert horizon. As he spurred his horse into a final aggressive charge to secure the massive financial reward, the front legs of his warhorse suddenly plunged deep into a patch of soft, unstable sand, violently throwing the heavily armored bounty hunter to the ground. Suraka remounted and attempted a second charge, only to have his horse violently stumble again in the flat, seemingly solid terrain, sending a deep, terrifying psychological shockwave through the mind of the experienced desert raider. Bedouin warriors were pragmatic, heavily superstitious men who intuitively understood the physical mechanics of the desert, and Suraka instantly realized that the unnatural behavior of his horse signaled a massive, unseen protection over the men he was hunting. He sheathed his weapons, raised his empty hands, and shouted across the hot sand, explicitly asking Muhammad for a written guarantee of safety and future alliance. Abandoning the massive Meccan bounty in favor of a profound geopolitical intuition, Muhammad, a stateless fugitive fleeing for his life with no standing army, instantly agreed to the terms, ordering Abu Bakr to write a legally binding treaty of protection for the bounty hunter on a flat piece of bleached bone. This incredibly tense, specific minor plot perfectly demonstrates the absolute, unyielding confidence Muhammad possessed in the ultimate success of his statecraft, guaranteeing physical protection to his own assassin as if he were already an established, heavily armed emperor. Suraka took the bone and rode back toward Mecca, actively, deliberately misdirecting the other heavily armed pursuit parties, securing the long, agonizing coastal route for the remainder of the exhausting journey. After 8 days of relentless, punishing travel across the unforgiving coastal plains, the small, vulnerable party finally reached the massive, heavily irrigated, sprawling palm groves of their destination. The arrival of Muhammad in the oasis of Yathrib in September of 622 is not merely a geographic relocation. It is the exact formal, legal inception of the Islamic calendar, an event historically and geopolitically defined as the Hijra. The traumatized, heavily fractured population of the oasis poured out of their fortified stone houses to welcome the exhausted travelers, filling the narrow dirt roads with songs of praise, eager to surrender their broken political system to his neutral arbitration. But Muhammad did not enter the city as a triumphant, arrogant king demanding absolute submission. He entered as a cautious, strategic statesman who understood that the volatile, heavily armed factions of the oasis were separated by centuries of bitter blood feuds. When the various clan leaders aggressively competed for the immense honor of hosting the prophet in their own specific compounds, Muhammad intuitively recognized that favoring one tribe over another would instantly reignite the lethal jealousies that had previously destroyed the city. He deployed a masterful diplomatic solution, releasing the reins of his camel, Al-Kaswa, and publicly declaring that the animal was guided by a higher authority, removing dangerous human political bias from the selection of his headquarters. The camel wandered slowly through the dusty, crowded streets of the oasis, finally stopping and kneeling in a neutral, unremarkable drying yard owned by two young orphans, a location that Muhammad immediately purchased at full market price to build his home and the first mosque. This act of absolute neutrality established his immediate, undeniable credibility, allowing him to seamlessly transition from a persecuted religious preacher into the supreme, undisputed sovereign executive of a new geopolitical entity. He renamed the massive oasis Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, forever altering its identity to Medina, and immediately initiated the most complex, profoundly revolutionary act of legal statecraft in the history of the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad possessed a profound analytical understanding of the immediate, suffocating economic crisis created by the migration. Knowing that hundreds of destitute Meccan refugees had just flooded into a specialized agricultural economy, the refugees, historically known as the Muhajirun, were skilled international merchants and commercial brokers who possessed no knowledge of date farming or irrigation, leaving them devoid of income and heavily dependent on charity. To prevent the creation of a resented, heavily impoverished underclass that would instantly destabilize the fragile peace of the oasis, Muhammad executed a radical, unprecedented socio-economic policy known as the Muwaqqa, or the Pact of Brotherhood. He legally formally paired every single destitute Meccan refugee with a wealthy, established resident of Medina, historically known as the Ansar, or the Helpers, creating a binding, specific economic partnership. The Ansar literally divided their vast agricultural properties, their homes, and their financial capital in half, willingly surrendering massive portions of their own accumulated wealth to perfectly stabilize the desperate refugees. This moving, authentic historical maneuver bypassed the slow, heavy mechanics of traditional charity, instantly creating a fiercely loyal, integrated economic base that perfectly fused the commercial genius of the Meccans with the agricultural wealth of the Medinans. But economic stabilization was merely the foundation required to execute a vastly more complex, dangerous political restructuring of the entire heavily armed oasis. Muhammad recognized that the ancient entrenched Bedouin system of blood loyalty was inadequate to govern a diverse, heavily armed city containing native pagan Arabs, powerful Jewish tribes, and hundreds of loyal Meccan refugees. If a Meccan refugee was murdered by a local farmer, the refugee possessed no blood relatives in the city to demand justice, meaning the delicate social fabric would instantly collapse back into total, devastating anarchy. To prevent this, he drafted a detailed, explicitly written legal framework historically recognized as the Constitution of Medina, a document that violently severed the ancient Arabian reliance on biological ancestry. The Constitution formally, legally bound the heavily armed pagan Arab tribes, the wealthy Jewish clans like the Banu Nadir and the Banu Kanuka, and the destitute Meccan refugees into a single unified, indivisible political identity known as the Ummah. This was a staggering, unprecedented paradigm shift, declaring that political citizenship and mutual defense were no longer dictated by who your grandfather was, but by your explicit, voluntary adherence to a shared, heavily codified civic pact. Under this new constitution, if the city was attacked by an external enemy, every single tribe, regardless of their specific religious theology, was legally obligated to pool their financial resources and their martial strength to defend the sovereign borders of Medina. It explicitly guaranteed absolute religious freedom and internal legal autonomy for the Jewish tribes, allowing them to govern their own internal disputes according to the laws of the Torah, while firmly recognizing Muhammad as the ultimate, absolute appellate judge for any conflict that threatened the entire oasis. The document effectively abolished the terrifying, chaotic practice of localized blood feuds by declaring that the legal responsibility for paying blood money was communal, neutralizing the toxic mechanics of tribal vengeance. By meticulously drafting and securing unanimous, calculated consent for this brilliant legal architecture, Muhammad neutralized the explosive internal fault lines of the city, transforming a traumatized, bleeding oasis into a disciplined, heavily militarized city-state. He had successfully executed the most dangerous, consequential escape in the history of the ancient world, outmaneuvering the greatest economic and military power in the Arabian Peninsula. But the true, terrifying geopolitical reality of the Hijra was that the hundreds of Meccan refugees who had followed him into the desert had been forced to leave their vast fortunes, their properties, and their entire past livelihoods behind in Mecca. The Quraysh had illegally, aggressively seized the abandoned wealth of the Muslims in Mecca, actively selling their stolen properties to fund massive, lucrative trade caravans traveling north to Syria, passing incredibly close to the sovereign borders of the newly established state. The time for quiet, peaceful endurance in the shadows of the mountains had officially, legally expired, replaced by the raw, urgent mathematics of national survival. The newly forged, disciplined Islamic State, surrounded by hostile tribes and aware of the massive Meccan armies preparing in the south, was about to deploy aggressive, necessary strategy of economic warfare to forcefully reclaim its stolen leverage. The successful migration to Medina provided the vulnerable Muslim community with a sovereign, heavily fortified agricultural sanctuary, but it failed to solve the devastating, immediate reality of their economic starvation. The hundreds of Meccan refugees who had fled across the desert possessed no capital, no access to their confiscated properties in the south, and no functional agricultural skills to extract a living from the volcanic soil of their new home. Muhammad understood that relying on the immense voluntary charity of the Medinan helpers was a fragile, temporary economic bandage that would inevitably trigger deep social resentment if the refugees did not rapidly secure their own independent revenue streams. But the Quraysh of Mecca had not simply confiscated the empty homes of the fleeing Muslims. They had actively, systematically liquidated those stolen properties to finance massive, lucrative trade caravans heading north to the Byzantine markets of Syria. These heavily laden merchant convoys, carrying the stolen wealth of the very people starving in Medina, had to physically traverse the ancient coastal trade route that ran close to the sovereign borders of Muhammad's new city-state. Operating with a cold, calculated geopolitical pragmatism, Muhammad recognized that he now possessed the precise geographic leverage required to actively choke the economic lifeblood of the Meccan elite. He initiated a strategic, disciplined campaign of asymmetric economic warfare, dispatching small, mobile, heavily armed reconnaissance patrols into the deep desert to monitor, harass, and intercept the commercial traffic of the Quraysh. These initial patrols were not massive military invasions. They were precise, calculated intelligence, gathering operations designed to unnerve the merchant lords and explicitly signal that the northern trade routes were no longer an uncontested, safe logistical corridor. For months, the heavily armed Meccan caravans managed to evade these small interception parties, utilizing experienced Bedouin scouts to bypass the typical watering holes and push through the desert under the cover of deep darkness. But the simmering, tense geopolitical standoff violently escalated into an irreversible, catastrophic global crisis during a sensitive, controversial reconnaissance mission in the desolate valley of Nakhla. In January of 624, Muhammad dispatched a small elite covert squad of 8 men, led by a loyal commander named Abdullah ibn Jahsh, explicitly ordering them to travel south toward the hostile outskirts of Mecca. Muhammad handed Abdullah a sealed, written mandate, strictly commanding him not to break the wax seal until the squad had traveled for 2 full days. An incredible piece of operational security designed to blind any Meccan spies embedded in Medina. When Abdullah finally opened the document in the deep desert, the orders explicitly instructed him to proceed to the valley of Nakhla, situated directly between Mecca and Tarif, to quietly gather intelligence on the movements of the Quraysh caravans. The squad arrived at the valley and successfully spotted a small, lucrative Meccan caravan carrying raisins, leather, and fine trade goods, escorted by only 4 heavily armed guards. But the tactical timing of this encounter presented a massive, agonizing legal and theological dilemma for the Muslim scouts, because it occurred on the final day of Rajab, one of the 4 ancient, sacred months during which all tribal warfare and bloodshed was strictly, universally forbidden across the Arabian Peninsula. Abdullah and his men engaged in a tense, compressed tactical debate hidden in the rocky ridges, realizing that if they waited for the sun to set and the sacred month to officially end, the caravan would securely cross the heavily fortified borders of the Meccan sanctuary, escaping with the stolen wealth. Making a unilateral, aggressive command decision, the Muslim squad broke from their cover, fired a lethal volley of arrows that instantly killed one of the guards, captured 2 others, and seized the entire lucrative cargo, driving it back north to Medina. When the squad arrived in the oasis and presented the captured wealth, Muhammad was profoundly furious, explicitly reprimanding Abdullah and stating with clarity that he had never ordered them to initiate lethal combat during the sacred month. The shedding of blood in the valley of Nakhla was not merely a tactical mistake. It was a massive, devastating geopolitical disaster that handed Abu Jahl and the elite oligarchs of the Quraysh the exact explosive propaganda victory they had been desperately seeking. The merchant lords loudly, aggressively broadcast to the entire Arabian Peninsula that Muhammad had fundamentally violated the most sacred, non-negotiable laws of the desert, explicitly framing the Muslims not as a persecuted religious minority, but as a dangerous, lawless syndicate of murderous bandits. The intense, heavy political pressure sitting on Muhammad's shoulders was only alleviated when a profound, specific Quranic revelation descended, explicitly addressing the complex moral mathematics of the crisis. The verses openly acknowledged that fighting during the sacred month was a grave offense, but stated with unyielding clarity that violently persecuting people for their faith, driving them from their homes, and denying them access to the sacred sanctuary was a vastly greater crime in the eyes of the Creator. This revelation fundamentally, permanently altered the strategic reality of the conflict, explicitly authorizing the use of lethal military force to actively defend the community and forcefully reclaim their stolen geopolitical rights. The undeniable, terrifying point of no return had been crossed, and the volatile, low-intensity economic blockade was about to rapidly, violently collide with the overwhelming military superiority of the Quraysh. In the early spring of 624, the efficient intelligence network in Medina intercepted a massive, vital piece of commercial data regarding the movements of the most lucrative Meccan caravan of the entire year, a massive convoy returning from the wealthy markets of Gaza, carrying the accumulated profits of almost every single prominent family in Mecca, estimated at a staggering 50,000 gold dinars, was currently making its slow, heavy descent down the coastal route toward the city. This massive accumulation of capital was actively managed and heavily guarded by Abu Sufyan, a brilliant, calculating, and pragmatic aristocratic statesman who operated as one of the supreme commercial architects of the Quraysh. Muhammad instantly recognized that intercepting this specific, massive caravan would not simply reclaim the stolen wealth of his followers. It would inflict a devastating, lethal blow to the economic foundation of the Meccan elite. He immediately called for a general mobilization in Medina, quickly assembling a mobile, lightly armed strike force of exactly 313 men, possessing only 2 horses and roughly 70 transport camels, strictly outfitting the party for a swift, overwhelming ambush rather than a pitched, sustained military battle. But Abu Sufyan was not a careless, ignorant merchant. He was a paranoid, experienced logistical master who possessed an intricate, sensitive intelligence network of his own. As the massive caravan slowly approached the dangerous, heavily contested intersection of the trade routes near the wells of Badr, Abu Sufyan physically rode ahead of his main column to personally scout the watering holes. In a masterpiece of ancient, analytical desert forensic intelligence, Abu Sufyan bypassed the local Bedouin informants and instead carefully inspected the dried camel dung left behind near the wells by recent riders. He physically broke open the heavy, dried dung and discovered small, intact date stones perfectly embedded within the fibers, specifically identifying them as the distinct, heavily cultivated dates grown exclusively in the agricultural oasis of Medina. He instantly, mathematically realized that Muhammad's heavily armed scouts had already occupied the area, confirming his worst, terrifying commercial nightmare that a massive ambush was imminent. Abu Sufyan immediately diverted his slow, heavily laden caravan sharply west toward the unforgiving, desolate shoreline of the Red Sea, desperately initiating a forced, exhausting march to bypass the deadly trap. Simultaneously, he dispatched a fiercely loyal, aggressive courier named Damdam to ride at maximum speed directly to Mecca to demand immediate, overwhelming military intervention to save the city's entire seasonal economy. Damdam arrived in the lower valley of Mecca executing an ancient, theatrical, and terrifying Bedouin alarm designed to instantly shock the entire city into total military mobilization. He rode his exhausted camel directly into the central courtyard of the Kaaba, having violently slashed the animal's nose so that it bled profusely, intentionally ripped his own shirt open, and sat backward on the saddle, screaming that the lifeblood of the city was about to be severed by the forces of Muhammad. The profound, aggressive shockwave of panic that swept through the merchant republic was instantaneous, instantly overriding their usual cautious, transactional political debates. Abu Jahl, seizing the ultimate, anticipated opportunity to finally crush the monotheistic movement in open, heavily armed combat, rapidly organized a massive, overwhelming, and heavily armored strike force. He mobilized a lethal, trained army of over 1,000 men perfectly equipped with chainmail armor, heavy lances, and accompanied by a terrifying mobile cavalry force of exactly 100 warhorses. This was not merely a rescue mission. It was a massive theatrical display of imperial power, accompanied by singing women, heavy drums, and massive supplies of wine, designed to explicitly demonstrate the unassailable, supreme martial dominance of the Quraysh to the entire Arabian Peninsula. While the massive, heavily armed Meccan juggernaut marched slowly north through the blistering heat, Abu Sufyan successfully executed his brilliant, desperate coastal evasion, securing the safe passage of the massive caravan back into the heavily fortified borders of Mecca. He immediately sent a fast rider to Abu Jahl's advancing army, explicitly informing them that the economic assets were secure, the primary objective was achieved, and advising the massive army to simply turn around and return home to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Several prominent, rational clan leaders within the Meccan army strongly advocated for retreat, arguing that initiating a brutal, lethal battle against their own blood relatives over a secured caravan was a massive, unnecessary geopolitical mistake. But Abu Jahl, blinded by his own toxic, arrogant ego and obsessed with eliminating Muhammad, loudly, aggressively shamed the dissenting leaders, explicitly declaring that the Quraysh would march to the wells of Badr, slaughter the upstarts, and throw a massive, visible feast to permanently terrify the rest of Arabia into submission. Meanwhile, roughly 90 miles southwest of Medina, Muhammad's lightly armed, heavily outnumbered strike force was slowly approaching the wells of Badr, unaware that their target had escaped and that a massive, heavily armored army was marching directly toward them. When the efficient Muslim reconnaissance patrols captured 2 young water carriers drawing from the wells and violently interrogated them, the terrifying logistical reality of the situation crashed down upon the Muslim leadership. Muhammad extracted the exact intelligence, determining the staggering size of the Meccan force by mathematically calculating the number of camels the enemy slaughtered for food each day, instantly realizing that his 300 men were walking directly into a devastating, lethal military meat grinder. He immediately halted the march and convened a massive urgent council of war, a strictly democratic consultative process known as the Shura, perfectly demonstrating that his spiritual authority did not legally permit him to act as an unyielding military dictator. The complex, sensitive political dilemma facing the council was rooted in the strict, literal legal wording of the Constitution of Medina. The pact explicitly required the heavily armed Ansar, the native Medinan helpers who constituted the vast majority of the strike force, to physically protect Muhammad within the sovereign borders of their own city, but it did not legally obligate them to march out and fight an offensive, lethal war in the open desert. Muhammad explicitly turned to the leaders of the Ansar politely, but firmly asking for their counsel, essentially offering them the legal, understandable option to turn their forces around and march safely back to the oasis. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, the powerful, respected aristocratic chieftain of the Ansar, stepped forward and delivered a profound, unwavering pledge of military loyalty that permanently bonded the destiny of the 2 fractured communities. He explicitly stated that if Muhammad ordered them to march their horses directly into the depths of the Red Sea, the men of Medina would follow him without a single moment of hesitation, fully committing his people to the terrifying crucible of total war. With the unified political resolve of the Ummah firmly secured, Muhammad ordered the small, heavily outnumbered army to advance directly toward the strategic watering holes of the Badr Valley to establish a tactical defensive perimeter. The exact critical positioning of the Muslim camp was determined by a brilliant, pragmatic piece of tactical advice offered by a seasoned military veteran named Hubab ibn al-Mundhir. Hubab approached Muhammad and respectfully, analytically asked if the current location of the camp was explicitly dictated by divine revelation, or if it was merely a matter of human military strategy. When Muhammad confirmed it was simply a matter of strategy, Hubab immediately pointed out a massive, fatal logistical flaw in their current positioning, noting that they were leaving several viable watering holes accessible to the advancing enemy. Hubab advised that they immediately break camp, march directly forward to the closest well to the anticipated Meccan line of advance, destroy and fill in all the other wells with heavy sand, and construct a massive, heavily guarded water cistern for themselves. This aggressive, brilliant logistical maneuver guaranteed that the massive, heavily armored and exhausted Meccan army would arrive at the battlefield deprived of water in the searing, punishing heat of the Arabian desert. On the night of March 12, 624, a massive, uncharacteristic torrential downpour swept across the entire valley, radically altering the physical terrain and granting a massive, critical tactical advantage to the vastly outnumbered Muslim forces. The heavy rain compacted the loose, unstable sand on the elevated Muslim position, creating a solid, reliable foundation for their defensive shield wall, while simultaneously transforming the lower, sloping approach of the Meccan army into a deep, exhausting, slippery mud trap. The next morning, as the massive, intimidating, heavily armored ranks of the Quraysh slowly crested the sandy dunes and stared down at the small, silent, disciplined Muslim formation holding the water supply, the arrogance of the Meccan elite began to fracture. In accordance with the stylized, ancient martial traditions of Arabian warfare, the battle did not begin with a massive, chaotic clash of infantry. It began with a theatrical, psychological sequence of individual champion duels. 3 of the highest-ranking, most aristocratic warlords of the Meccan army, Utbah ibn Rabah, his brother Shaiba, and his son al-Walid, marched confidently into the open expanse between the two armies, heavily armored and violently demanding worthy challengers. Muhammad responded by sending out 3 of his most lethal, experienced close combat specialists, his uncle Hamza, his cousin Ali, and a fierce, loyal warrior named Ubaidah. In a terrifying, swift, and brutal sequence of skilled martial combat, the 3 heavily armored Meccan aristocrats were dismantled and killed instantly, spectacularly decapitating the supreme, revered senior leadership of the Quraysh in a matter of minutes. The massive, horrifying psychological shock of seeing their most powerful, respected warlords bleeding out into the sand shattered the arrogant, confident morale of the Meccan infantry. Abu Jahl, screaming in uncontrollable fury and desperately attempting to salvage the collapsing psychological momentum of his massive army, ordered a total, overwhelming, and chaotic frontal assault against the Muslim lines. But Muhammad had explicitly ordered his men to maintain a strict, disciplined defensive posture, forbidding them from breaking formation, and instructing them to wait until the heavily armored Meccans exhausted themselves, slogging through the deep, slippery mud. As the massive, disorganized Meccan charge reached the killing zone, the disciplined Muslim archers unleashed a devastating, accurate volley of arrows, severely thinning the advancing ranks before the heavy, brutal clash of infantry finally commenced. The battle descended into a terrifying, claustrophobic, bloody melee of swinging Damascus steel, heavy iron shields, and the agonizing, desperate struggle for physical survival under the blistering desert sun. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, the unwavering religious conviction of the Muslim fighters, combined with the extreme, crippling physical dehydration of the Meccan forces, fundamentally inverted the mathematical reality of the battlefield. The elite, heavily armored infantry of the Quraysh began to fracture, losing their tactical cohesion, and ultimately breaking into a panicked, chaotic, and humiliating total rout. Abu Jahl, the brilliant, ruthless architect of the massive persecution, the man who had ordered the brutal torture of slaves and the starvation of the Banu Hashim, was violently struck down in the chaotic melee by 2 young, aggressive boys from Medina, finally ending his toxic reign of terror. When the blinding, heavy dust of the desert finally settled over the bloody, silent battlefield, the terrifying magnitude of the geopolitical shift became undeniably historically clear. Roughly 70 of the highest-ranking, most powerful aristocratic leaders of the Quraysh lay dead in the sand, and another 70 were taken as valuable, leveraged prisoners of war. The Muslims had lost only 14 men, achieving an asymmetrical, devastating military victory that permanently shattered the carefully constructed, intimidating aura of Meccan invincibility. The shocking news of the battle radiated outward through the deep desert like a massive, destabilizing seismic wave, reordering the complex, heavily armed tribal hierarchy of the entire Arabian Peninsula. The massive, arrogant merchant republic of Mecca had been profoundly, physically humiliated by the very men they had aggressively persecuted and driven out of their city, fundamentally proving that their massive wealth could not buy military supremacy against a disciplined, unified ideological force. Medina was no longer viewed as a fragile, vulnerable refuge for desperate outcasts. It was now universally, formally recognized as a lethal, organized, and legitimate regional power capable of dictating the terms of global trade. But the elite merchant lords of the Quraysh, who survived the humiliating, chaotic retreat back to Mecca, were not simply going to quietly accept the catastrophic destruction of their geopolitical supremacy. Fueled by a profound, agonizing desire for blood vengeance and terrified by the closure of their vital northern trade routes, the remaining oligarchs of the city began immediately, meticulously planning a massive, overwhelmingly lethal counterstrike. The spark of Badr had successfully ignited the massive combustible political landscape of Arabia, fundamentally guaranteeing that the fragile, complex geopolitical survival of the newly established Islamic State was about to be pushed to the terrifying breaking point. The humiliating, unprecedented military disaster at the wells of Badr did not pacify the merchant republic of Mecca. It plunged the entire city into a period of profound, aggressive mourning and absolute economic mobilization. Abu Sufyan, the brilliant logistical master who had successfully saved the massive trade caravan from interception, emerged from the political vacuum created by Abu Jahl's death as the undisputed supreme executive of the Quraysh. He immediately decreed that not a single ounce of profit from the saved caravan would be distributed to the merchant investors, legally freezing the massive 50,000 dinar fortune to finance the raising of a new, overwhelming military force. For an entire year, the oligarchs of Mecca utilized this massive capital reserve to hire fierce Bedouin mercenaries, purchase heavily reinforced armor, and secure a devastatingly fast cavalry wing, explicitly designed to obliterate the newly formed Islamic State. In the spring of 625, a disciplined, heavily armored Meccan army of exactly 3,000 men, accompanied by 200 war horses and a massive logistical supply train, began its deliberate, heavily armed march north toward the oasis of Medina. Muhammad's intelligence network, utilizing fast riders and embedded local informants, detected the massive troop movement weeks in advance, stripping the Quraysh of the element of tactical surprise. As the massive Meccan army arrived and set up a heavily fortified encampment near the towering, jagged volcanic slopes of Mount Ushud, just 3 miles north of Medina, Muhammad convened an urgent, critical war council to determine the strategic defense of the city. His own calculated, pragmatic military instinct was to remain behind the heavily fortified stone walls of the central oasis, forcing the massive Meccan army to exhaust its supplies in a costly, frustrating, urban siege. But the dynamics of the Shura, the consultative democratic council, revealed a profound, volatile generational divide within the ranks of the Medinan military. The younger warriors, emboldened by the massive, improbable victory at Badr and eager to prove their martial valor, fiercely advocated for marching out into the open plain to meet the enemy head-on. Muhammad, recognizing that overriding the unified, aggressive will of his own infantry could dangerously fracture the fragile internal morale of the young state, conceded to the democratic majority and ordered the army to march out to Mount Uhud. He arrived at the base of the mountain with a heavily outnumbered force of roughly 1,000 men. But this number was instantly compromised when a cynical political faction within Medina, led by Abdullah ibn Ubay, abandoned the battlefield and marched 300 men back to the city. Facing a massive, heavily armored army of 3,000 men with a vastly depleted force of barely 700, Muhammad executed a masterful, specific defensive deployment using the jagged physical geography of the mountain to anchor his vulnerable rear. The single massive tactical vulnerability of his formation was an exposed left flank, a narrow, accessible mountain pass that the rapid, lethal Meccan cavalry could easily exploit to encircle his infantry. To neutralize this threat, Muhammad deployed exactly 50 elite archers to the top of a small strategic rocky hill known as Ainain explicitly, repeatedly commanding their leader that under no circumstances were they to abandon their post. Even if they saw the main army being slaughtered by birds, the battle commenced with the heavily armored Meccan infantry, launching a massive, aggressive frontal assault against the entrenched, disciplined Muslim shield wall. Despite being outnumbered nearly 5-1, the fierce, coordinated counter-attack of the Medinan infantry broke the tactical cohesion of the Meccan center, causing their standard-bearers to fall and sending a massive shockwave of panic through the Quraysh ranks. As the Meccan infantry began to physically retreat, abandoning their heavy equipment and their lucrative supply camps, a fatal, disastrous breakdown of military discipline occurred on the strategic hill of Ainain. 40 of the 50 archers, watching the enemy flee and blinded by the entrenched, toxic Bedouin desire to claim the lucrative spoils of war, abandoned their specific orders and rushed down the hill to loot the Meccan camp. Khalid ibn al-Walid, a brilliant, observant cavalry commander of the Quraysh who would later become one of the greatest military tacticians in history, immediately recognized the massive, fatal gap in the Muslim defensive line. Khalid violently swung his heavily armed, extremely fast cavalry squadron around the undefended hill, slaughtering the remaining 10 archers, and launched a devastating, lethal charge directly into the exposed rear of the disorganized Muslim infantry. The tactical reversal was absolute, instantaneous, and devastating, trapping the Muslim forces in a chaotic, claustrophobic slaughter between the returning Meccan infantry and the charging cavalry. The disciplined defensive formation disintegrated into a desperate, heavily fragmented struggle for pure biological survival, resulting in the brutal, targeted death of Muhammad's uncle, the fierce warrior Hamza, who was struck down by a precisely thrown javelin. In the center of the chaotic, blinding dust of the melee, a heavily armored Meccan fighter threw a massive stone that directly struck Muhammad in the face, smashing his helmet, breaking his tooth, and sending him bleeding heavily to the ground. A sudden, terrifying rumor rapidly swept through the panicked ranks of both armies that the Prophet of Islam had been physically assassinated, triggering a massive collapse of morale among the Medinan fighters. But a small, loyal core of elite veterans physically surrounded the bleeding Prophet, locking their heavy shields together to form an impenetrable human fortress, and began a slow, agonizing, costly tactical retreat up the steep, rocky slopes of Mount Uhud. The heavily armored Meccan cavalry, unable to pursue the retreating infantry up the jagged, unstable volcanic rocks, were forced to halt their advance, essentially freezing the battlefield in a bloody, unresolved stalemate. Abu Sufyan, standing at the base of the mountain and surveying the heavy casualties inflicted upon the Medinan forces, loudly declared the defeat of Badr avenged, ordered his massive army to pack their camps, and began the long march back to Mecca. The Battle of Uhud was a bitter, traumatizing tactical defeat for the Islamic State, explicitly proving the fatal, absolute cost of abandoning strict military discipline in favor of personal material greed. But strategically, Abu Sufyan had failed to achieve his primary, necessary geopolitical objective, which was the total, permanent eradication of Muhammad and the complete destruction of the Medinan state. The Muslims buried their 70 dead in the blood-soaked sand at the base of the mountain, absorbed the painful, sobering lessons of their tactical failure, and immediately began heavily reinforcing the economic and military infrastructure of the oasis. For 2 years, a tense, volatile geopolitical Cold War gripped the Arabian Peninsula, characterized by swift, targeted raids, complex diplomatic maneuvering, and the aggressive consolidation of Bedouin alliances by both competing superpowers. Abu Sufyan recognized that a traditional pitched infantry battle was fundamentally insufficient to dismantle the entrenched, heavily fortified agricultural infrastructure of Medina. He engineered a massive, unprecedented diplomatic achievement, utilizing the vast, lucrative financial reserves of the Meccan merchant elite to negotiate a massive, multi-tribal military confederacy historically known as the Azab. The Quraysh allied with the massive, heavily armed Bedouin confederation of the Ghatafan tribe, promising them a full year's harvest of the lucrative date crops of Khaybar simply to secure their lethal cavalry units. In the bitter, freezing winter of 627, a staggering, terrifying coalition army of exactly 10,000 heavily armed warriors, possessing thousands of camels and experienced cavalry, began a massive, overwhelming march toward Medina. To fully grasp the terrifying, almost apocalyptic scale of this threat, the entire physical population of Medina, including women and children, barely numbered 3,000 people, making the invading force larger than the entire demographic capacity of the defending city. When Muhammad's intelligence network delivered the precise mathematical parameters of the advancing confederacy, the Medinan Military Council realized that matching a 10,000-man army in an open desert battle was a guaranteed, mathematically absolute suicide. They required an unconventional, asymmetric defensive strategy capable of neutralizing the massive, overwhelming numerical superiority of the Bedouin cavalry before they could breach the agricultural core of the oasis. The brilliant, paradigm-shifting tactical solution was offered by an observant, experienced foreign convert named Salman the Persian, a man intimately familiar with the massive, sophisticated siege warfare of the Sassanid Empire. Salman pointed out that the physical geography of Medina was naturally heavily fortified on three sides by dense, impassable volcanic lava fields and heavily walled date farms, leaving only the open, flat northern approach physically vulnerable to a massive cavalry charge. He advised the council to abandon the ancient Arabian traditions of open field combat and instead physically dig a massive, wide, continuous trench across the entire exposed northern border of the city. This concept was so alien to the swift, mobile raiding culture of the Arabian Peninsula that the advancing Bedouin warlords possessed no tactical doctrine, no siege equipment, and no historical experience to physically overcome it. The engineering logistics of constructing the trench were brutal, requiring the entire male population of Medina, including Muhammad himself, to engage in grueling, exhausting manual labor around the clock in the freezing winter temperatures. They physically carved a massive ditch deep enough that a horse could not jump out of it, and wide enough that a heavily armored warrior could not successfully leap across it without being impaled by the concentrated archery fire of the defenders, standing on the elevated inner bank. When the massive, intimidating 10,000-man coalition army finally arrived at the northern edge of the oasis, expecting a swift, glorious, decisive military victory, they were baffled by the massive gash in the earth. The ferocious, mobile Bedouin cavalry, useless against an engineered static defense, was forced to halt at the edge of the ditch, initiating a tense, frustrating, stagnant siege that perfectly neutralized their massive numerical advantage. But Abu Sufyan, operating as a sophisticated geopolitical strategist, quickly recognized that if he could not physically breach the trench from the north, he had to collapse the defensive perimeter from the inside out. He quietly dispatched heavily armed diplomatic envoys to secretly negotiate with the Banu Qurayza, a powerful, heavily armed Jewish tribe occupying a massive, fortified stone fortress on the absolute southern, undefended border of Medina. Under the strict, heavily binding legal terms of the Constitution of Medina, the Banu Qurayza were explicitly obligated to defend the oasis from external threats. But the overwhelming, terrifying size of the Meccan coalition convinced their leadership that the Islamic State was mathematically doomed. The Banu Qurayza quietly, deliberately agreed to break their treaty with Muhammad, promising to launch a massive, coordinated surprise attack against the undefended women and children sheltering in the southern farms, aiming to tear the Muslim defense apart from the rear. When Muhammad's intelligence network intercepted the terrifying details of this internal betrayal, the psychological tension within the freezing, heavily starved ranks of the Muslim defenders reached a state of absolute agonizing panic. They were trapped between a massive, frustrated 10,000-man army to the north and a heavily armed, hostile internal faction preparing to slaughter their families to the south, creating a suffocating, mathematically impossible tactical dilemma. In this exact critical moment of absolute geopolitical despair, the survival of the Islamic State was secured not by a massive clash of swords, but by a masterful, psychological act of covert diplomatic sabotage. A prominent, respected aristocratic leader of the Ghatafan tribe named Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud, who was trusted by both the Quraysh and the Banu Qurayza, quietly crossed the trench in the dead of night and secretly embraced Islam. Muhammad immediately ordered Nu'aym to keep his conversion hidden, explicitly authorizing him to use deceptive psychological warfare to fracture the fragile, heavily strained political alliance between the besieging army and the treacherous internal tribe. Nu'aym executed a brilliant, dangerous diplomatic wedge operation, first visiting the heavily fortified compound of the Banu Qurayza, playing on their deep, rational fears of being abandoned. He explicitly warned the Jewish elders that the Quraysh and the Ghatafan were mobile Bedouin tribes who could simply pack their camps and leave if the siege failed, leaving the Banu Qurayza alone to face the brutal, heavily armed wrath of Muhammad. Nu'aym advised the Jewish leaders to demand several prominent aristocratic hostages from the Quraysh before initiating the southern attack, strictly as a guarantee that the Meccans would not simply abandon the siege. Immediately after planting this logical toxic seed of doubt, Nu'aym quietly crossed back into the massive camps of the Quraysh, visiting Abu Sufyan and the senior coalition warlords. He explicitly falsely warned them that the Banu Qurayza had regretted breaking their treaty with Muhammad, and that the Jewish tribe was secretly planning to demand Meccan hostages solely to hand them over to the Muslims as an apology. When Abu Sufyan formally dispatched a delegation to the Banu Qurayza demanding that they initiate the southern attack, the Jewish elders refused, strictly demanding the delivery of Meccan hostages as a guarantee of mutual commitment. The paranoid, suspicious Meccan leadership, instantly recalling the exact warning planted by Nu'aym, refused to hand over their noblemen, proving the fabricated intelligence to be true in the minds of both suspicious factions. The vital, necessary military alliance shattered, resulting in absolute diplomatic deadlock and permanently neutralizing the terrifying threat of the southern internal attack without a single drop of blood being shed. Meanwhile, the massive, expensive logistics of maintaining a 10,000-man army stationary in the freezing, barren desert began to fundamentally destroy the morale of the besieging confederacy. The heavily relied upon supply chains of the Quraysh were incapable of feeding thousands of horses and heavily armed mercenaries during a prolonged, stagnant winter siege. On the 27th night of the standoff, a massive, violently freezing desert hurricane swept through the valley, destroying the heavy leather tents of the Meccans, violently overturning their cooking fires, and plunging the massive camp into absolute freezing misery. The Ghatafan mercenaries, exhausted, unpaid, and demoralized by the horrific weather and the failed diplomacy, simply packed their remaining supplies and marched away into the darkness, abandoning the expensive coalition. Abu Sufyan, staring at his collapsed tents and realizing that his massive, unprecedented geopolitical masterstroke had been neutralized by a simple ditch and a brilliant psychological operation, ordered the remnants of the Quraysh to retreat back to Mecca. The Battle of the Trench was a monumental, decisive strategic victory that permanently altered the complex balance of power in the Arabian Peninsula. The massive financial reserves of the Quraysh were permanently exhausted, and their absolute terrifying capability to project offensive military power against Medina was irrevocably broken. The tactical reality had profoundly, permanently shifted from defense to offense, proving that the disciplined, heavily unified political architecture of the Islamic State could mathematically outlast the most massive, funded military coalition the ancient desert could produce. With the threatening military shadow of the Quraysh finally broken, Muhammad turned his strategic macroeconomic focus towards securing the absolute, final diplomatic legitimacy necessary to absorb the entire Arabian Peninsula. He recognized that military victory alone could not permanently integrate the superstitious, traditional Bedouin tribes, because absolute regional legitimacy required unchallenged access to the sacred, revered sanctuary of the Kaaba. The trusted merchant was about to execute an unarmed, controversial diplomatic maneuver that would baffle his own heavily armed generals, proving that the true mastery of statecraft lies in the genius of the long game. To transition a heavily militarized, localized rebellion into a universally recognized, legitimate sovereign state, a leader must eventually pivot from the raw, bloody mathematics of battlefield survival to the sophisticated, nuanced arena of international diplomacy. By the early spring of 628, the vast, volatile geopolitical landscape of the Arabian Peninsula had settled into a tense, exhausting military stalemate. The massive, expensive coalition army of the Quraysh had shattered against the defensive trench of Medina, permanently neutralizing their capacity to project offensive armored power. But Muhammad, operating with a profound, analytical macroeconomic perspective, recognized that mere military survival was fundamentally insufficient to integrate the fragmented, superstitious Bedouin tribes of the desert. Absolute regional legitimacy, the exact specific political leverage required to unify the Arabian landmass, remained exclusively locked within the heavy stone walls of the Kaaba in Mecca. As long as the elite merchant lords physically controlled the ancient sanctuary and legally barred the Muslims from performing the sacred pilgrimage, the Islamic State would simply be viewed by the neutral Bedouin tribes as a massive armed rebel outpost rather than a legitimate geopolitical equal. He recognized that launching a massive, destructive military invasion of Mecca would violate the sacred sanctuary, shedding blood in the exact location where blood was strictly forbidden, which would permanently destroy his moral authority among the observing tribes. Muhammad engineered a brilliant, unprecedented, and dangerous diplomatic maneuver, explicitly designed to paralyze the heavy military architecture of the Quraysh by weaponizing their own sacred, foundational laws against them. He publicly announced to the armed, battle-hardened veterans of Medina that they were going to march directly south toward the hostile, fortified borders of Mecca. But they were not marching as an invading army. They were marching as peaceful pilgrims, explicitly intending to perform the Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage to the Kaaba. During the sacred month of Dhu al-Qida, he ordered exactly 1,400 men to strip off their heavy chainmail armor, to leave their massive, intimidating lances and war shields in the armories of Medina, and to don the ihram, the simple, unstitched white cloth garments of the pilgrim. They were legally permitted to carry only a single sheathed traveler's sword, strictly for defense against wild animals or rogue bandits, and they brought alongside them 70 heavy camels explicitly marked with the traditional garlands of religious sacrifice. This unarmed, exposed march was not a naive, reckless act of religious faith. It was a perfectly calculated, massively explosive geopolitical trap engineered to short-circuit the absolute core of Meccan authority. The elite oligarchs of the Quraysh derived their massive, lucrative regional prestige from their publicized role as the strict, impartial guardians of the sacred house, legally bound to guarantee safe passage to any peaceful pilgrim honoring the sanctuary. If Abu Sufyan and the merchant lords ordered their armed cavalry to slaughter 1,400 unarmed, peaceful men wearing the white garments of pilgrimage and leading sacrificial animals, they would permanently destroy their own guarded reputation. The neutral Bedouin tribes observing the massacre would instantly realize that the Quraysh had abandoned the sacred laws of the sanctuary to settle a petty political vendetta. Instantly vaporizing the delicate relied upon neutral zone that generated Mecca's entire global trade monopoly. But if the merchant lords simply stood back and allowed Muhammad to peacefully enter the city, circle the Kaaba, and publicly demonstrate his absolute devotion to the site, they would essentially be handing him a massive, undeniable political victory right in the center of their own capital. The Quraysh were trapped in an agonizing, unwinnable tactical dilemma, and they reacted with heavy panicked aggression, instantly mobilizing their elite armored cavalry commanded by the brilliant tactician Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid deployed his fast, lethal squadrons directly onto the main northern trade route, explicitly intending to physically block the advancing pilgrims and deliberately provoke a violent skirmish that could be blamed on the Muslims. Muhammad's embedded intelligence scouts spotted the heavy dust of the Meccan cavalry on the horizon, prompting a swift, disciplined tactical detour that perfectly avoided the armed blockade. He ordered a native experienced Bedouin guide to lead the massive column of pilgrims off the traveled main road, physically hacking their way through rough, jagged, unmapped volcanic ravines. This grueling, exhausting detour successfully bypassed Khalid's cavalry, depositing the unarmed Muslim force on the extreme western edge of the Meccan territorial boundary, in a dry, exposed plain known as Hudaybiyah. As the massive column finally halted in the searing, unforgiving heat of the plain, Muhammad's heavy transport camel stubbornly, abruptly knelt into the sand and refused to move another inch toward the city. The men, exhausted and thirsty, tried to physically urge the massive animal forward, assuming it was simply fatigued by the harsh, rocky detour. But Muhammad, perfectly reading the deep, underlying tactical reality of the moment, explicitly declared that the exact same unseen authority that had once stopped the ancient war elephants from destroying the Kaaba was currently restraining his camel. He officially ordered the 1,400 men to establish their camp directly on the plain of Hudaybiyah, setting up their simple leather tents right on the absolute, tense geopolitical boundary line of the Meccan sanctuary. The immediate critical logistical crisis facing the camp was a severe, dangerous lack of drinking water, as the primary well in the area was choked with heavy sand and barely yielded a trickle of muddy moisture. A specific, authentic minor plot unfolded as the men, facing severe, rapid biological dehydration in the blinding sun, desperately approached Muhammad to resolve the absolute logistical failure of the encampment. Historical accounts detail that Muhammad took a single, simple wooden arrow from a quiver, handed it to a companion, and ordered him to physically climb down into the dry, dusty shaft of the well and plant the arrow into the center of the sand. The moment the heavy wood pierced the compacted earth, a massive pressurized surge of fresh, clean water instantly breached the surface, rapidly filling the heavy stone basin and securing the biological survival of the exposed camp. With the physical logistics stabilized, Muhammad initiated the complex, high-stakes diplomatic maneuvering, dispatching a carefully selected, strategic envoy directly into the hostile, fortified center of Mecca. He chose Uthman ibn Affan, a wealthy, elegant patrician who belonged to the massive, powerful Umayyad clan, the exact same aristocratic bloodline that actively ruled the upper echelons of the Quraysh. Uthman was the perfect, calculated diplomatic asset because his massive network of wealthy, armed relatives inside the city essentially guaranteed him absolute diplomatic immunity from sudden assassination. Uthman walked past the heavy Meccan guards and delivered Muhammad's explicit, transparent message, reiterating that the massive force encamped at Hudaybiyah had no military intentions and simply requested temporary, peaceful access to the Kaaba. The merchant lords, paranoid and divided, politely received Uthman but explicitly, firmly refused to allow Muhammad into the city, essentially detaining the envoy while they desperately debated how to resolve the massive crisis on their border. The heavy, prolonged delay of Uthman's return instantly triggered a profound, dangerous psychological panic back in the exposed camp at Hudaybiyah. A dark, terrifying rumor rapidly swept through the 1,400 unarmed men that their respected envoy had been violently, brutally assassinated by the oligarchs of the Quraysh. If the rumor was true, the complex diplomatic mission had instantly devolved into a lethal, mathematically impossible military scenario, leaving unarmed men stranded in the open desert facing the imminent, massive charge of the Meccan cavalry. In this exact tense moment of absolute geopolitical uncertainty, Muhammad executed a masterful, profound psychological operation designed to solidify the internal morale of his exposed forces. He sat quietly beneath the heavy, shaded canopy of a large acacia tree and formally requested that every single man in the camp step forward and physically swear a new binding oath of allegiance. This specific event, historically enshrined as the Bayat al-Ridwan, or the Pledge of Pleasure, was a solemn, unwavering military commitment where 1,400 men grasped his hand and explicitly swore to fight to the absolute death to avenge their murdered envoy. The sheer, terrifying psychological impact of this event was not directed at the men swearing the oath. It was precisely targeted at the observant Meccan spies who were quietly watching the camp from the surrounding rocky ridges. The spies raced back to Mecca and delivered a terrifying, sobering intelligence report to Abu Sufyan and the oligarchs, explicitly detailing the absolute, unyielding martial discipline of the men sitting at their border. They warned the elite merchant lords that if they ordered their cavalry to attack, the men at Hudaybiyah would not simply break and run, they would engage in a brutal suicidal last stand that would inflict heavy, unacceptable casualties on the Meccan forces. This intimidating intelligence broke the diplomatic deadlock, rapidly prompting the Quraysh to immediately release Uthman unharmed and dispatch their own supreme diplomatic negotiator to securely resolve the standoff. The man the Quraysh selected was Suhail ibn Amr, an educated, articulate, and stubborn aristocratic diplomat renowned across the peninsula for his heavy, unyielding negotiating tactics. Suhail arrived at the camp in Hudaybiyah carrying explicit, non-negotiable instructions from the elite council. They would refuse to allow the Muslims to enter Mecca this year, demanding a massive visible political concession to save the bruised ego of the Quraysh. The tense, complex drafting of the actual treaty document is a masterpiece of high-level geopolitical negotiation, perfectly highlighting Muhammad's willingness to sacrifice short-term ego for massive, permanent, strategic gains. Muhammad called for Ali ibn Abi Talib to physically act as the scribe, instructing the young warrior to begin the document with the standard sacred Muslim invocation, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate." Suhail instantly, aggressively objected, explicitly stating that the Quraysh did not recognize those specific theological titles, and firmly demanded the traditional, ancient Arabian opening, "In your name, O God." Muhammad, ignoring the furious, offended murmurs of his own loyal companions, calmly instructed Ali to erase the offending phrase and write exactly what the Meccan diplomat demanded. Muhammad then dictated the opening clause of the treaty, stating this is what Muhammad, the messenger of God, has agreed upon with Suhail ibn Amr. Suhail immediately halted the negotiation a second time, delivering an arrogant, insulting legal objection, declaring that if the Quraysh actually believed he was the messenger of God, they would never have fought him in the first place. He explicitly demanded that Ali erase the sacred title of prophethood, insisting that the document simply record his secular biological name, Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. Ali, a fierce, loyal warrior who had repeatedly risked his life for the movement, lowered his pen and explicitly, emotionally refused to physically erase the sacred title of his leader. In a profound, stunning display of absolute emotional discipline and strategic clarity, Muhammad gently took the heavy parchment, asked Ali to physically point out where the specific words were written, and used his own hand to quietly, permanently rub the title out. By surrendering these emotional, symbolic points of ego, Muhammad secured the absolute, legally binding mechanics of a treaty that structurally, permanently guaranteed the ultimate destruction of the Quraysh. The specific terms of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah dictated a massive enforced 10-year military truce between the two states, ending the devastating cycle of destructive raids and massive coalition sieges. The treaty legally stipulated that the massive, unarmed Muslim force had to immediately turn around and walk back to Medina without performing the pilgrimage this year, saving the fragile, arrogant political face of the Meccan elite. However, it formally guaranteed that the very next year, the entire city of Mecca would evacuate for 3 full days, allowing the Muslims absolute, uncontested access to the sacred Kaaba to perform their rituals in peace. But the absolute most controversial, agonizing clause of the treaty was an asymmetrical, unbalanced extradition policy, specifically regarding fleeing defectors. Suhail explicitly demanded that if a member of the Quraysh fled Mecca and sought religious asylum in Medina without the legal permission of their guardian, Muhammad was legally obligated to arrest them and physically return them to their armed oppressors. But if a Muslim defected from Medina and fled to Mecca, the Quraysh explicitly refused to return them, cementing an unequal, humiliating legal double standard into the very fabric of the agreement. The senior leadership of the Medinan army, specifically the fiercely loyal, aggressive commander Umar ibn al-Khattab, was profoundly furious at what he perceived as a massive, devastating diplomatic surrender. Umar stormed directly up to Abu Bakr and then to Muhammad himself, aggressively demanding to know why the victorious armed army of God was accepting such humiliating, degrading legal terms from a defeated pagan enemy. Before Muhammad could fully placate the frustrated ranks of his own army, a bruised, authentic, and horrifying minor plot physically crashed directly into the middle of the negotiation. While the wet ink on the heavy parchment was still drying, a young man violently stumbled out of the rocky mountain pass, his legs bound in thick iron chains, his back covered in fresh, bloody whip marks. The young man was Abu Jandal, the biological son of the very Meccan diplomat Suhail ibn Amr, who had secretly converted to Islam and had been brutally, aggressively tortured and imprisoned by his own father. Abu Jandal had managed to escape his heavy restraints, dragging his chains across the burning desert, explicitly begging the armed Muslim camp for immediate, desperate political and religious asylum. Suhail instantly stood up, violently grabbed his bleeding son by the collar of his shirt, and explicitly, coldly pointed out to Muhammad that this was the very first absolute test of the newly signed extradition clause. The massive armed crowd of 1,400 Muslim men watched in absolute suffocating horror as their prophet was forced to make a mathematically flawless, agonizing legal decision. Muhammad, operating with a cold, unbroken commitment to the absolute sanctity of international law, looked into the eyes of the bleeding youth and gently, firmly told him to be patient, surrendering him back into the brutal custody of his oppressor. The sheer psychological agony of watching the young man dragged back toward Mecca in heavy iron chains almost broke the disciplined, strained morale of the Medinan forces. When Muhammad finally ordered the frustrated men to physically slaughter their sacrificial animals on the plain of Hudaybiyah, signaling the official end of their aborted pilgrimage, the men stubbornly refused to move. It was only through the brilliant, empathetic advice of his wife Salama, who quietly advised him to silently, publicly perform his own sacrifice without speaking a word, that the men finally broke their paralysis and followed his physical example. As the disappointed, demoralized army marched slowly back across the desert toward Medina, viewing the entire expedition as a massive, humiliating geopolitical failure, Muhammad understood the absolute profound genius of the long game he had just successfully engineered. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah was not a defeat. It was the single, absolute, most massive geopolitical victory in the entire history of the movement. By officially, legally signing a massive international treaty with Muhammad, the arrogant merchant lords of the Quraysh had unknowingly, permanently recognized the state of Medina as an absolute, legitimate, sovereign peer. The 10-year truce neutralized the massive, expensive military threat of the Quraysh, allowing the organized, disciplined Islamic State to rapidly, aggressively expand its diplomatic and political influence among the massive Bedouin tribes without the constant fear of a Meccan invasion. The unequal extradition clause, which caused such profound internal anger, contained a massive, calculated logistical flaw that the arrogant merchant lords had failed to recognize. Muhammad knew that motivated, persecuted converts fleeing Mecca, when legally barred from entering Medina, would not simply return to slavery. They would independently occupy the unpoliced coastal regions, forming lethal, autonomous raiding camps that devastated the Meccan trade routes outside of Muhammad's jurisdiction. The Merchant Republic had effectively signed a document that guaranteed their own slow, inevitable economic and political suffocation, trapped by the rigid, specific legal terms of their own demanded treaty. The armed military conflicts were officially over, replaced by a massive, complex, strategic game of geopolitical chess that the elite oligarchs of Mecca were mathematically unequipped to play. Within exactly 2 years, the brilliant, controversial diplomatic groundwork laid in the blistering heat of the Hudaybiyah plain would irreversibly fracture the absolute foundation of the ancient Arabian order. The orphaned merchant, having flawlessly secured his sovereign territory and permanently neutralized the military capacity of his enemies, was now quietly, systematically preparing for the ultimate, anticipated return to the very city that had violently cast him out. International treaties are rarely dismantled by the deliberate, heavily armored armies of the sovereign states that sign them. They are almost always destroyed by the reckless, localized violence of their entrenched tribal proxies. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah had successfully frozen the primary military conflict between Medina and Mecca, but it had explicitly permitted the surrounding Bedouin tribes to formally align their own regional security with either of the two major superpowers. The Banu Quza'a tribe immediately signed a mutual defense pact with Muhammad, utilizing the diplomatic umbrella of Medina to protect their trade routes. While their ancient, bitter blood rivals, the Banu Bakr, officially allied themselves with the merchant lords of the Quraysh. For nearly 2 years, the strict legal framework of the treaty held the volatile Bedouin factions in a state of tense, monitored equilibrium. But in the dark, moonless nights of November 629, a local territorial dispute between the two proxy tribes near the watering hole of Al-Waita violently escalated into a lethal, unauthorized skirmish. The Banu Bakr launched a devastating nocturnal raid against the Banu Quza, driving the terrified families into the sacred boundaries of the Meccan sanctuary, where they were brutally slaughtered while desperately seeking religious asylum. This regional tribal violence became a catastrophic, irreversible geopolitical crisis because a rogue faction of the Quraysh elite, blinded by their historical hatred of the Banu Quza, secretly smuggled heavy weapons and disguised fighters into the dark to actively assist the Banu Bakr. By deliberately spilling blood within the sacred sanctuary and actively funding the slaughter of a former ally of Medina, the merchant lords of Mecca committed a fatal, mathematically undeniable breach of international law. Abu Sufyan, the supreme executive of the Quraysh and the master logistical architect of their surviving economy, woke up the next morning and realized with cold, profound geopolitical terror that a handful of rogue aristocrats had just handed Muhammad the exact legal justification required to dismantle the merchant republic. He understood that the legal protections of Hudaybiyah were instantly voided, leaving the wealthy, vulnerable city of Mecca exposed to the heavily militarized, disciplined army of the Islamic State. Abu Sufyan immediately mounted his fastest horse and rode desperately across the searing desert toward Medina, attempting to execute a frantic, unilateral diplomatic mission to renegotiate the treaty before the slow, inevitable machinery of war could mobilize against his city. His arrival in the agricultural oasis provides a specific, authentic historical minor plot that perfectly illustrates the profound, irreversible shift in the regional balance of power. Abu Sufyan walked into the quiet, heavily shaded courtyard of his own biological daughter, Habibah, a woman who had embraced monotheism years earlier and was now legally married to Muhammad. As the exhausted, heavily perspiring merchant lord moved to sit upon the simple, woven floor mattress belonging to the Prophet, his daughter stepped forward and physically, deliberately folded the mattress away, pulling it out of his reach. When the humiliated patriarch asked if the mattress was too good for him or if he was too good for the mattress, she delivered a cold, strictly logical theological rebuke, stating that an impure polytheistic warlord was physically unfit to sit upon the resting place of the messenger of God. This visceral personal rejection by his own bloodline demonstrated that the ancient, entrenched Bedouin laws of biological loyalty had been superseded by the rigid, unyielding civic and spiritual architecture of the new state. Abu Sufyan left his daughter's home and desperately sought an audience with Muhammad in the central mosque, explicitly begging the leader to formally renew the non-aggression pact and extend its legal deadline. Muhammad listened to the frantic appeals of the Meccan statesman in total, impenetrable silence, refusing to offer a single word of confirmation, denial, or diplomatic comfort. Abu Sufyan then approached the senior lieutenants of the state, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Ali, desperately pleading for them to intercede on his behalf. But he was met with a unified, disciplined wall of silent rejection. Ali, recognizing the complete political impotence of the Meccan leader, quietly advised Abu Sufyan to simply mount his horse and ride back to his valley, logically pointing out that a treaty fundamentally broken by blood could not be repaired by desperate words. Abu Sufyan returned to Mecca empty-handed, fully aware that a massive synchronized military hammer was about to swing down upon his city, yet ignorant of the exact timing or the staggering, overwhelming scale of the impending invasion. Back in Medina, Muhammad immediately initiated a total city-wide military mobilization, but he wrapped the entire operation in a suffocating, impenetrable blanket of absolute operational security. He dispatched fast riders to the allied Bedouin tribes across the peninsula, ordering them to arm their warriors and march toward Medina. But he deliberately withheld the specific strategic target of the campaign from even his most senior, trusted generals. The preservation of this massive tactical secret resulted in a tense, revealing internal security crisis involving a veteran Muslim fighter named Hatib ibn Abi Baltar. Hatib was a loyal soldier who had fought bravely at the Crucible of Badr, but he was a legally vulnerable outsider in Mecca, possessing no powerful aristocratic bloodline to protect the wives and children he had been forced to leave behind in the hostile city. Terrified that the impending invasion would provoke the desperate Quraysh into slaughtering his unprotected family, Hatib drafted a secret, treasonous letter explicitly warning the merchant lords of the massive army gathering in the north. He hired a traveling woman to hide the heavy parchment deep within the braided coils of her hair and quietly ride south toward Mecca to deliver the intelligence. Muhammad's sophisticated internal counterintelligence network intercepted rumors of the leak, and he instantly dispatched Ali and another fast cavalryman to ride down the southern trade route and intercept the courier. They caught the terrified woman resting at a desert oasis, threatened to physically dismantle her luggage and unbind her hair, and successfully extracted the sealed letter, returning the heavily treasonous document directly to the war council in Medina. Umar ibn al-Khattab, reading the severe, undeniably fatal security breach, drew his sword and explicitly demanded the immediate execution of Hatib, arguing strictly based on the rigid, uncompromising military laws of treason. Muhammad stayed the hand of his fierce commander, choosing instead to publicly interrogate the trembling veteran to extract the underlying, human logic behind the betrayal. When Hatib confessed his deep, agonizing vulnerability and swore that he had not abandoned his faith but merely acted out of desperate, biological fear for his unprotected children, Muhammad accepted his rationale. He formally pardoned the veteran, overriding the rigid mechanics of military execution with a profound, strategic application of executive clemency, permanently securing the intense, emotional loyalty of his troops by demonstrating that the state recognized the frailties of human fear. With the critical intelligence leak successfully plugged, the massive, disciplined army of the Islamic State finally marched out of the oasis in January of 630 during the fasting month of Ramadan. The demographic composition of the marching column was a staggering, visual testament to the geopolitical mastery of the previous 10 years. Exactly 10,000 heavily armed men marched in quiet, rigid unison, a massive, unprecedented multi-tribal coalition containing the native Medinan farmers, the original Meccan refugees, and thousands of newly allied Bedouin warriors marching under their own tribal banners. This was the largest, most centralized military force ever assembled in the history of the Arabian Peninsula, advancing deliberately across the desert, not to fight a grueling war of attrition, but to execute a masterpiece of psychological warfare. As the massive army reached the elevated, rocky valley of Marra az-Zahran, located just a few miles outside the dark, fortified borders of Mecca, Muhammad ordered a halt as the sun slipped below the horizon. He instructed every single warrior in the 10,000-man column to physically gather wood and light their own individual, visible campfire along the sprawling ridges overlooking the lower valley. In the deep, freezing darkness of the desert night, the elite guards patrolling the walls of Mecca looked up toward the northern mountains and saw an entire horizon seemingly engulfed in a terrifying, unbroken sea of flame. Abu Sufyan, frantically riding out of the city gates under the cover of night to personally scout the perimeter, stared up at the thousands of flickering fires and mathematically calculated that an army of this magnitude was functionally unstoppable. While navigating the dark, rocky terrain near the camps, Abu Sufyan was abruptly intercepted and captured by a heavy cavalry patrol commanded by al-Abbas, the uncle of Muhammad who had recently fled Mecca to join the advancing army. Al-Abbas placed the captured supreme leader of the Quraysh on the back of his own mule and rode him directly through the center of the massive, heavily armed encampment, forcing the merchant lord to physically witness the overwhelming, disciplined military reality of the new empire. The next morning, Al-Abbas stood Abu Sufyan on a high rocky overlook, as the various battalions of the Islamic army paraded deliberately past them in heavily armored, synchronized columns, their distinct tribal banners snapping in the dry morning wind. When the elite, heavily armored cavalry of the Ansar and the Muhajirin marched past in total absolute silence, bristling with heavy Damascus steel and moving with a terrifying, unified martial purpose, Abu Sufyan turned to Al-Abbas in profound, quiet shock. He murmured that the kingdom of his nephew had become a magnificent, terrifying thing, viewing the massive formation through the rigid, cynical lens of secular imperial power. Al-Abbas quickly corrected the fallen patriarch, explicitly stating that this was not a terrestrial kingdom built on the taxation of trade routes. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of prophethood. Abu Sufyan, stripped of his massive commercial empire, his military leverage, and his political arrogance, formally surrendered the city of Mecca without drawing his sword, riding rapidly back to the lower valley to loudly warn his people that resistance was a biological impossibility. Muhammad divided his massive army into 4 distinct, organized columns, ordering them to enter the city from 4 separate geographical access points with explicit, non-negotiable orders not to shed a single drop of blood unless they were actively attacked. Only the southern column, commanded by the fierce tactician Khalid ibn al-Walid, encountered a small, aggressive pocket of rogue Quraysh hardliners who foolishly fired arrows from the rocky slopes, resulting in a brief, localized skirmish that was instantly suppressed. The rest of the city fell in absolute terrified silence, the merchant lords locking themselves inside their heavy courtyard homes, fully expecting the massive invading army to execute the traditional, brutal ancient rites of plundering the wealth, enslaving the women, and slaughtering the aristocratic male leadership. But as Muhammad physically rode his camel through the dusty, familiar streets of his childhood, traversing the exact same routes where he had once been pelted with garbage and violently hunted as a stateless fugitive, he did not project the arrogant, terrifying posture of a conquering Roman general. Historical accounts meticulously record that he rode with his head bowed so profoundly low in deep, intense gratitude to the Creator that his dark beard physically brushed against the heavy leather of his camel's saddle. He rode directly into the massive open courtyard of the Kaaba, halting his camel before the ancient stone structure that had served as the lucrative, corrupt spiritual and economic engine of the merchant republic for centuries. He did not deliver a lengthy, vindictive political speech to the terrified crowds watching from the rooftops. He simply dismounted, took his heavy wooden bow in his hand, and walked deliberately toward the 360 idols encircling the sanctuary. Using the tip of his bow, he systematically, physically pushed the heavy stone and wooden statues off their pedestals, watching them shatter into useless, fragmented pieces on the hard-packed earth of the courtyard. With every falling idol, he quietly recited a single profound verse from the Quran, declaring that truth has come and falsehood has departed. Indeed is falsehood, by its nature, ever bound to depart. He then ordered Bilal, the former Abyssinian slave who had been brutally pinned to the scorching desert sand with a boulder years earlier, to physically climb to the absolute highest point on the roof of the Kaaba. Bilal stood upon the very architecture of his former oppressors, placed his hands over his ears, and projected the melodic, resonant call to prayer across the silent, subjugated valley of Mecca, an auditory declaration that the ancient social hierarchy of the Arabian Peninsula was permanently eradicated. The elite, terrified oligarchs of the Quraysh were finally summoned to gather in the center of the courtyard, standing defenseless before the man they had starved, tortured, and hunted for 20 grueling years. Muhammad looked at the trembling faces of the men who had orchestrated the assassination attempts and the brutal sieges, and he asked them a simple, terrifying question, inquiring what they logically expected him to do with them now. The merchant lords, desperately attempting to invoke the ancient Bedouin codes of mercy, quietly answered that they expected goodness from a noble brother and the son of a noble brother. In the single, absolute greatest act of geopolitical clemency in the history of the ancient world, a decision that short-circuited the entrenched destructive cycle of Arabian blood vengeance, Muhammad delivered his verdict. He quoted the exact words of forgiveness that the ancient prophet Joseph had spoken to his treacherous brothers, declaring that there would be no blame upon them this day, and firmly commanded, "Go, for you are free." With that single sweeping legal amnesty, the massive volatile physical conquest of Mecca was flawlessly executed without a systemic massacre, instantly transforming the bitterest, most entrenched enemies of the state into loyal, integrated citizens of the expanding empire. Over the next 2 years, the disciplined, brilliantly structured political and military architecture of Medina rapidly absorbed the remaining fragmented Bedouin tribes of the vast desert, unifying the entire Arabian landmass under a single overarching civic law for the first time in human history. In the early spring of 632, sensing the rapid, inevitable biological deterioration of his own mortal body, Muhammad undertook his final, profound pilgrimage back to the sacred city of Mecca. He rode his camel slowly up the rocky slopes of Mount Arafat, standing before a vast, silent ocean of over 100,000 pilgrims, delivering a sweeping, codified legal and moral address known to history as the farewell sermon. He did not use his final public moments to boast of his massive territorial conquests or his brilliant military victories. He meticulously, logically dismantled the final, lingering structural injustices of the ancient world. He legally abolished the ancient destructive practices of generational blood feuds, explicitly nullified the toxic, exploitative systems of financial usury, and codified the strict, non-negotiable legal rights of women within the framework of property and marriage. But the absolute defining climax of his final address was an explicit, uncompromising declaration of universal human equality, structurally dismantling the deep, arrogant tribal racism of the ancient world. He boomed across the silent, sun-drenched valley that an Arab possesses no inherent superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a white man possess any structural superiority over a black man, except by the quiet metric of piety and good action. He asked the massive crowd if he had successfully delivered the message, and when 100,000 voices roared their confirmation across the rocky plain, he looked up toward the searing sky and asked the Creator to bear witness to the completion of his duty. Months later, resting quietly in his small, unadorned mud-brick room in Medina, the orphaned merchant who had structurally redesigned the political reality of the earth simply closed his eyes and allowed the heavy, exhausting burden of his prophethood to finally pass. When the physical reality of a great architect ultimately expires, the myopic observers of history often expect the massive, complex structure he built to rapidly, violently collapse back into the dust. But the true, profound metric of a civilization is not found in the biological longevity of its founder. It is measured by the structural resilience of the ideas left behind in the silent, empty rooms of power. The vast, heavily armored empires of the Byzantines and the Sassanids, who had dismissively ignored the deep desert a century earlier, are now permanently buried beneath the shifting, unforgiving sands of time, their massive stone walls reduced to quiet, archaeological whispers. the arrogant, lucrative merchant republic of the Quraysh, built upon the exploitation of the weak and the blind worship of silent stone idols, dissolved, leaving behind no trace of its vast silver fortunes. Empires built exclusively upon the taxation of trade routes and the terrifying thrust of heavy cavalry always inevitably fracture, their massive geopolitical boundaries washing away like shallow footprints in the heavy, relentless tide of human history. What truly endures, what stubbornly refuses to erode under the massive crushing weight of passing centuries, is the quiet, persistent human hunger for absolute, structural justice and the deep, profound dignity of the individual soul. The belief that the heavily armed tyrant and the starving orphan are bound by the exact same universal, unseen law is a concept vastly more powerful, vastly more permanent than any physical fortress ever constructed by the hands of men. And as we slowly step back from the blinding, searing heat of the Arabian desert, moving away from the clash of Damascus steel and the heavy rhythmic marching of ancient caravans, the grand, tense narrative of this era begins to softly, gently fade into the quiet dark. The struggles of those distant, sun-blasted generations, their deep, agonizing sorrows, their brilliant, calculated victories, and their quiet, desperate searches for meaning have all safely passed into the vast, protective silence of the earth. Allow the heavy, complex weight of human history to slowly slip from your shoulders, releasing the tension of the geopolitical chessboards and the noise of the ancient markets. Find a deep, comforting solace in the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breathing, knowing that beneath the chaotic, uncertain surface of the world, there is a gentle, abiding peace that outlasts the rise and fall of kings. Rest quietly in the warmth of the present moment, and let the vast, beautiful expanse of the night carry you softly into sleep. Good night.